Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we journey to a place most will never see, a world of order and silence, of discipline refined to its sharpest edge, of walls that hold 900 men and the system that shapes them. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. This is a story about justice, about culture, about the price societies pay for safety and the cost extracted from those who fall outside the patterns. It is a story told not with judgment, but with careful attention, with the understanding that every system built by human hands reflects the values of those who built it, for better and for worse. We will walk through mountain prisons and urban detention centers. We will hear voices when they are permitted to speak. We will meet those who enforce the rules and those who suffered beneath them. We will see what happens when order becomes absolute, when discipline becomes identity, when the machinery of justice grinds forward with a precision that leaves little room for mercy or mistake. This is not a story with easy answers. It is not a tale of heroes and villains. It is something more complicated, more human, more reflective of the eternal struggle to balance individual freedom with collective safety, to deliver justice without becoming instruments of oppression. Get comfortable, settle in, let the day fall away. Tonight, we explore the Japanese prison system. And we begin where many journeys in Japan begin, in the mountains, where mist gathers at dawn and silence is more than absence of sound. It is a philosophy, a way of life, a warning and a promise. Let's begin. The mountain prison, in the heart of the Japanese mountains, where mist clings to ancient peaks and silence is a language older than words, there stands a fortress. Not of war, but of order. After months of negotiation, the doors have opened. What lies within is a world apart. Nagano Prefecture stretches across the highlands of central Japan, a landscape of cedar forests and snow-touched ridges that have stood watch over human settlements for centuries. The roads that wind through these mountains are narrow and steep, carved into hillsides where temples once perched in solitude. It is here, far from the neon glow of Tokyo, far from the coastal cities where most of Japan makes its home, that the prison sits. From the outside, it does not announce itself with menace or grandeur. The building is modern, functional, its walls the color of concrete and clouds. There are no watchtowers looming over the grounds, no coils of razor wire glinting in the mountain light. It could be mistaken for a government office or a school, something administrative and forgettable. But the absence of ornament is itself a statement. This is a place where nothing is wasted, where every surface serves a purpose, where beauty, if it exists at all, comes from precision rather than decoration. The approach is quiet. The only sounds are the wind moving through pine branches and the soft crunch of gravel beneath footsteps. Even the air feels different here, thinner somehow, as if the altitude has stripped away everything unnecessary. It is the kind of quiet that makes visitors lower their voices without being asked. The kind that settles into the bones and demands respect. After months of correspondence, after applications and permissions and diplomatic negotiations between governments and institutions, access has been granted. It is a rare thing, this opening of doors. Japanese prisons do not often welcome outsiders, especially those carrying cameras and questions. The society that built these walls prefers to keep its corrections private, its discipline internal. But for 2 days, the gates will stand open. For 2 days, the world beyond these mountains will be allowed to look inside. There are conditions, of course. There are always conditions. The terms are laid out before the first foot crosses the threshold. No filming of doors. It is a strange request at first, puzzling in its specificity, until one considers what doors represent in a place like this. They are boundaries between freedom and captivity, between the world that continues outside and the world that has stopped within. To film them would be to give shape to that division, to make visible the line that inmates cross each day in their minds, even when their bodies remain still. No questioning of guards in front of inmates. The hierarchy must be preserved, the chain of command unbroken. To challenge authority in the presence of those who live under it would be to introduce doubt, to create a crack in the foundation of order upon which everything here is built. The guards do not explain themselves to prisoners, and so they will not explain themselves to cameras while prisoners watch. And perhaps most telling of all, only 2 inmates will be permitted to speak. 2 voices out of 900. 2 stories selected, approved, prepared. The interviews will take place in offices, not cells. Guards will be present, silent sentinels ensuring that even in speech, the rules are followed. These restrictions are not presented with apology or justification. They simply are. Take them or leave them. Enter on these terms or do not enter at all. The choice is made. The doors open. The first impression is silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of suppression, of 900 men moving through space without sound. It is a silence that feels intentional, cultivated, enforced. Footsteps are soft. Voices, when they exist at all, are murmurs that fade before they can echo. Even breathing seems quieter here, as if the air itself has learned to be still. The second impression is order. Everything is in its place. Not approximately in its place, not near enough, but exactly where it belongs. In the entrance corridor, sandals are lined up before the cells with geometric precision. Each pair faces the same direction. Each pair maintains the same distance from its neighbor. They form a perfect row, identical in their alignment. And in that alignment is a kind of beauty. The beauty of discipline. The beauty of submission to a greater pattern. The walls are clean, not merely swept or mopped, but pristine, as if they were completed yesterday and have never been touched by human hands. The floors gleam beneath fluorescent lights that cast no shadows. There are no scuff marks, no stains, no signs of the wear that time usually brings to places where people live. It is as if decay itself has been forbidden, as if entropy has been held at bay by sheer force of will. This is a modern facility, built within the last few decades according to standards that prioritize function and control. The architecture speaks of efficiency, of systems designed to process human beings with the same reliability that factories process raw materials. There are no bars in the traditional sense, no iron cages or medieval dungeons. Instead, there are smooth walls and heavy doors that lock with electronic precision. The severity, if it can be called that, is not in the materials but in the totality of the system they create. 900 men live here, 900 souls confined within these walls, ranging from those who stole bread to those who took lives. The prison does not segregate by severity of crime, in the way some Western institutions might. A pickpocket and someone convicted of ending another's life may share the same corridor, eat from the same kitchen, march to the same factory floor. What matters is not what they did outside, but how they behave inside. The past is fixed. The present is what can be shaped. From common offenders to those whose crimes made headlines, they are all subject to the same rules, the same schedule, the same expectations. There is no special treatment for celebrity or infamy. There is only compliance or consequence. And in that uniformity, the management believes lies the path to rehabilitation, not through individual therapy or personal reflection, but through collective discipline, through the grinding down of ego and the rebuilding of character according to a template as precise as those sandals lined up in the hall. The guards move through the space with quiet authority. They do not shout unless necessary. They do not engage in casual conversation with those they oversee. Their role is not to befriend or counsel, but to maintain order, to ensure that every minute of every day unfolds according to the schedule that has been set. They are the human embodiment of the system, and like the system, they are implacable, consistent, unyielding. Watching them, it becomes clear that this is not cruelty in the conventional sense. There is no sadism here, no pleasure taken in suffering, but neither is there warmth. What exists instead is a philosophy, a worldview that sees order as the highest virtue and discipline as the path to redemption. In Japan, where the individual has traditionally been understood in relation to the group, where harmony is valued above personal expression, the prison becomes a microcosm of a larger cultural truth. The comparison to European prisons is stark, where those institutions often struggle with overcrowding, where cells designed for one hold three, where inmates sleep on floors for lack of beds. Here there is space. Where Western prisons battle endemic filth, where plumbing fails and vermin thrive, here everything is clean. The difference is not merely in resources, but in philosophy. This is not a warehouse for the unwanted. This is a machine for transformation. And machines work best when properly maintained. The building itself tells a story of investment, of a government that allocated funds not just to contain, but to correct, that saw value in creating environments where rehabilitation could theoretically occur. The architecture is deliberate, every angle calculated, every corridor designed with purpose. Natural light enters through high windows, enough to mark the passage of day into night, but filtered, controlled, never harsh enough to create shadows that might provide visual relief from the uniformity. As the first day of filming comes to a close, as the light from the high windows shifts toward evening, the full weight of the place begins to settle. This is not a temporary holding facility. This is not a pause in someone's life. This is a total environment, a world complete unto itself, with its own laws and logic and rhythms. Time moves differently here. A year outside is a lifetime within. And for some, there will be many lifetimes yet to serve. Tonight, the cameras will be turned off. The outsiders will retreat to hotels in the valley below, where they can speak freely and move without permission. But the 900 will remain, as they remained last night, as they will remain tomorrow night, and the night after that. The silence will continue, the order will hold, and in the morning, when classical music drifts through the corridors to wake the sleeping, the machine will start again, as it always does, as it always will, until the last prisoner walks free or the last door closes forever. What lies ahead is a journey into that machine, into its rhythms and rituals, into the minds of those who built it and the lives of those who endure it. The mountain keeps its secrets well, but for 2 days, some of them will be revealed. The architecture of discipline morning comes not with birdsong, but with classical music. Beethoven filters through concrete corridors at precisely 6 o'clock. In this place, even time itself bends to order. Every moment measured, every movement prescribed. The sound begins softly, a piano sonata rising from speakers mounted high on the walls. The melody is familiar, rendered neutral by repetition, but still carrying some ghost of beauty. Music from another world, another century, belonging to no one here and therefore to everyone equally. In some cells, 6 men sleep on thin futons arranged with military precision across tatami mats. Each man occupies his designated space, marked out like coordinates on a grid. Even in sleep, the boundaries hold. When the music begins, the men rise slowly, methodically, their movements synchronized by habit. They fold their futons with practiced hands, smoothing every wrinkle, aligning every edge. In other cells, the morning unfolds in solitude. These are individual cells, the reward for exemplary behavior. The rooms are smaller, built for one, but in that reduction of space, there is an expansion of dignity. The schedule is absolute. 1 hour, 60 minutes from waking to readiness. Exactly 1 hour, divided into segments as precise as a surgeon's cuts. Breakfast arrives on trays through slots in the doors. Rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, a small piece of fish or tofu. The portions are measured to the gram, calculated to provide sustenance without satisfaction. The men eat in silence. The food is always the same. Words would only fill space that silence already occupies. After breakfast comes the hygiene ritual. In the communal cells, 6 men must share a single sink. They move around each other like dancers, each taking his turn without collision. The guards watch through small windows in the doors. Under that gaze, the men perform their ablutions with exaggerated care. Shaving is particularly ritualized. Each inmate is issued a safety razor and expected to use it properly. The message is clear. We trust you to hold a blade to your own throat and do nothing more than remove hair. That trust is not a gift. It is a test, administered daily. After the last face is shaved smooth, the cleaning begins. The floors must be swept and mopped. The sink must be scrubbed until it gleams. The toilet must be cleaned with chemicals that burn. Every surface is addressed, every corner examined. When they believe the cell is ready, they stand at attention and wait. The guard enters, moving with the attention of a quality inspector. He runs his hand along surfaces, checking for dust. He examines the alignment of items on shelves. Sometimes he nods and leaves. Other times he pauses at some imperfection invisible to untrained eyes. No words are spoken. The inmates know what the pause means. They will clean again. This is not cruelty, the guards would say. This is training. A man who learns to clean a cell properly is learning something deeper than housekeeping. He is learning discipline. He is learning respect. In Japan, the individual exists as part of a greater whole. The family, the company, the nation, each person is a thread in a fabric. The prison takes this belief and distills it to its essence. Here, the collective is everything. The morning ritual is complete. The men stand ready. Their uniforms are identical, grey garments without pockets. Their heads are shaved to the same length. When they line up, they become nearly indistinguishable. Only the numbers on their chests mark them as individuals. This uniformity is intentional. Practically, it makes escape more difficult. Philosophically, it reinforces the erasure of ego. You are one among 900. And yet, there are gradations. Those who demonstrate exceptional compliance are rewarded with individual cells. In an environment where everything is scarce, even small things carry enormous weight. The contrast with European prisons is impossible to ignore. In France, in Italy, in Britain, prisons bulge with excess population. Men sleep on floors. The institutions crumble from neglect. But here, there is space. There is cleanliness. From a material standpoint, an inmate in Nagano lives in better conditions than some free citizens in poorer nations. Yet material comfort and human dignity are not the same thing. A clean cell is still a cage, and the order that makes this place function comes at a price measured in the slow erosion of self. The first hour ends. The cells are empty, the men having moved on to the next phase. But the morning's work remains visible in every aligned object, every gleaming surface. This is the architecture of discipline, built not with steel and concrete alone, but with time and repetition and the gradual surrender of will. The warning and the wall. There is a room that exists outside of time, 4 meters square, padded walls, no books, no light from windows, no voice but your own. This is where rules, once broken, lead. This is isolation. The system begins gently. When a man steps out of line, he does not immediately disappear into solitary darkness. First comes the warning. The warning is delivered quietly. A guard approaches and speaks in low tones, his words carefully neutral. You have broken a rule. This is your first warning. That is all. For many men, the warning is enough. The shame of being singled out carries weight in a culture where losing face cuts deeper than physical pain. They adjust their behavior immediately. But some men persist. Perhaps they do not understand the rule. Perhaps they understand but do not care. Perhaps they are broken in ways that make compliance impossible. For these men, the warnings accumulate. Each warning is noted in a file that follows them, an invisible mark that guards consult when making decisions. The file grows heavier, the tolerance grows thinner, and then, if the behavior continues, the consequences arrive. The punishment cell exists apart, down corridors most prisoners never see. The architecture itself is different here. The walls are thicker, the doors are heavier, the silence becomes absolute. When a man is sentenced to isolation, he is stripped of his regular uniform and given something simpler. His possessions are removed entirely. The books some inmates are allowed, gone. The small radio that marks good behavior, confiscated. The letters from family, taken away. He is led to the cell by 2 guards. The building itself is the cage, and the punishment cell is merely a cage within the cage. The cell door opens. He enters. The door closes with a metallic click that sounds like the end of something. The space is small, 4 meters by 4 meters, sometimes less. The walls are padded with material designed to prevent self-harm. A man cannot break his skull against these walls, cannot do anything but sit or stand or lie upon the floor. There is a toilet. There is a thin mattress rolled out at night and taken away in the morning. There is nothing else. No window to mark the passage of day into night. The light comes from a fixture that glows constantly, turning all hours into one endless grey present. The sentence can last anywhere from 1 day to 60 days. 1 day for a minor violation, 60 days for violence or attempted escape. Most sentences fall somewhere in between. During isolation, there are no activities. Activities are markers of time, anchors that prevent hours from blending into undifferentiated mass. In the punishment cell, all these markers disappear. There is no work. Meals arrive through a slot, but without the structure of a dining hall, without other men eating beside you. You eat alone. You exist alone. The silence is so complete, you can hear your own heartbeat. There is no television. In regular cells, television privileges remind inmates that life continues beyond these walls. In isolation, that window closes. There is only the cell. There is only yourself. There is no reading. For some, reading was never important. For others, books were lifelines. The one escape the prison could not entirely control. To lose that escape is to lose the last refuge of imagination. Some men count. They count seconds, attempting to track minutes and hours through mental discipline. They count breaths. They count heartbeats until numbers grow so large they lose meaning. Others do not count. They let time dissolve. Stop trying to track its passage. Accept the present moment as all there is. This is sometimes easier, sometimes harder. The guards who oversee the punishment cells move through their duties with neutral efficiency. They deliver meals. They monitor through observation windows. They maintain logs. When asked about the system, the prison staff responds with calm certainty. This is not bullying. This is not cruelty. This is simply order. In Japan, order is a fundamental value. The group must function smoothly. The individual must align himself with collective needs. From this perspective, the man who refuses to follow rules has chosen to place himself outside the social contract. He has rejected harmony in favor of chaos. The punishment cell is a containment made manifest. The philosophy is coherent within its own terms. If one accepts that group harmony supersedes individual expression, then isolation becomes not torture, but correction. But philosophy and lived experience are not the same thing. In that padded room, in that endless grey light, the mind begins to feed on itself. Memories replay in obsessive loops. The boundary between thought and reality blurs. Some men emerge quieter than before, their defiance extinguished, their eyes carrying a new emptiness. Others emerge unchanged in visible ways, but marked internally. They will never again take for granted the simple act of seeing another human face. The punishment system is not publicized. It exists in the background, a tool used rarely but kept always ready. Its presence alone is sufficient to maintain order. Most inmates never see the inside of a punishment cell. They hear about it in whispered conversations. They imagine what it must be like and adjust their behavior accordingly. And so the days in the general population continue with clockwork precision, while somewhere in the depths of the building, others sit in padded silence and count the seconds of their exile, waiting for the door to open again, waiting to be returned to the regulated community that suddenly seems, by comparison, almost free. The factory of hours. At 7:50 in the morning, they march, not as individuals, but as a single organism. Shaved heads, Identical uniforms, steps synchronized. They're no longer names, they are numbers, and the work, they say, will set them free. The corridor fills with shuffling feet, a whisper of rubber soles against polished concrete. 50 men moving as one, their pace matched to an internal metronome wound into them through repetition. They wear grey. The colour is universal, neither dark enough to suggest menace nor light enough to offer hope. The fabric is rough, industrial, designed for durability. It chafes, but no one adjusts their collar. Their heads catch the fluorescent light, scalps shaved to stubble. This too is standard. The reasoning is practical, they say. Easier hygiene, harder to hide contraband. But the effect is transformative. Without hair, the men become interchangeable, components in a machine. At the front walks a guard. He does not look back. He knows they are following because the alternative is punishment. His stride is measured. He sets the pace. The men match it. Behind them, another guard brings up the rear, his body angled to keep the column in view. His eyes scan continuously for gaps, for hesitation, for any sign of deviation. The march is not silent, but neither is it loud. There is no talking, but the sound of breathing, of fabric rustling, of 50 pairs of lungs inflating in unison creates its own rhythm. They turn a corner. The corridor opens into a hall where all columns converge, several hundred bodies arranged in neat rows, each man at attention. A whistle blows. Work is about to begin. But first, there is preparation. The workout lasts exactly 3 minutes, timed with precision, measured to warm muscles without exhausting them. A guard stands at the front on a small platform. He demonstrates the movements. Arms raised, bend at the waist, straighten, twist left, twist right, touch your toes. The men mirror him, their movements synchronized by watching. Some are young, their muscles still athletic. Others are older, their backs stiff, their knees complaining, but performing anyway. The exercises are basic, the kind taught in schools and corporate wellness programs. Functional, efficient, boring in their predictability. But boring is safe. The 3 minutes end. Another whistle. The body is ready. The work can begin. The prisoners divide into groups, each directed toward a different factory. 50 men per factory. This number represents the maximum that can be supervised effectively. The work is varied. In one room, cushions are assembled. Foam padding cut, wrapped in fabric, sewn with industrial machines. The men develop calluses from handling rough materials. In another room, shoes are manufactured. Not prison sandals, but footwear for retail stores. The work is detailed. Soles must be glued without gaps. Laces threaded correctly. Quality control is strict. The men work for 8 hours. 8 hours with brief breaks for meals and bathroom visits, but otherwise continuous. The hands moving, the machines running, the products accumulating. The labor is compulsory. There is no option to refuse. The prison views work as an integral component of rehabilitation. The philosophy is straightforward. Work provides structure. It fills dangerous empty hours. It teaches discipline, the ability to perform tasks one does not wish to perform. Work, they say, rebuilds character. A man who arrives as a thief must learn the value of productive labor. Through work, he reconnects with society, prepares for re-entry into the world of law-abiding citizens. The work is unpaid in the conventional sense. Instead, they earn an allowance, held by the institution and given upon release. The amounts are small. A man who works diligently for a year might accumulate a few $100s, enough to survive the initial days of freedom, but not enough to rebuild a life. Still, it is something. During work hours, silence prevails. The machines make noise, but human voices are absent. Talking is forbidden. The prohibition is absolute. Guards patrol the factory floors, moving between workstations, observing from elevated platforms. They watch for lips moving, for heads turning, for any gesture indicating communication. And yet, communication is sometimes necessary. For these moments, there is a protocol. The worker must raise his hand and hold it aloft until a guard notices. Then, and only then, he may speak, addressing his question to the authority figure rather than a fellow inmate. This system is infantilizing, reducing grown men to school children. But it serves its purpose. It prevents the formation of alliances and conspiracies. The hours accumulate. Morning becomes afternoon. The men's hands continue their motions, guided by muscle memory now more than conscious thought. They are tired but cannot show it. They exist in a state of muted endurance. When the whistle finally blows, the machines power down. The men do not celebrate. They simply stand, align themselves once more into columns, and prepare to march back to their cells, back to the evening routines that will repeat tomorrow and the day after, until their sentences end or their bodies give out. The factory of hours closes for the night, but it will open again at dawn. It always does. 40 minutes of light, in a day measured by seconds. 40 minutes become an eternity. This is leisure time. This is when men remember they are human. Ping pong paddles strike, cards shuffle. For a brief window, voices are allowed. But first, there is lunch. The meal arrives on steel carts that roll through corridors with a hollow rumble. The men have already returned from the morning shift, washed their hands, and lined up according to protocol. The guards oversee distribution with seriousness that might seem excessive. But everything here carries meaning beyond its surface function. The guard inspects each tray. The vegetables must be equal in each serving. The protein is examined with particular care. Every man must receive exactly what every other man receives. The only variable is rice. Portions are calibrated according to physical activity. Those in heavy labor receive more. Those in lighter duties receive less. They eat quickly. The food is adequate, engineered to provide nutrition without pleasure. The taste is forgettable, designed to be neither so good it becomes something to crave, nor so bad it becomes something to dread. After lunch comes a brief respite, perhaps 15 minutes, perhaps 20. Some men read newspapers, provided by the institution, arriving several days late. The delay is intentional. Fresh news might contain information useful for escapes. Others use this time to cut their nails. Small clippers are distributed under supervision, checked out like library books. And some men simply sit, staring at walls or through barred windows, their minds wandering. Then the moment passes. It is time for what the administration calls leisure activity, though the term carries irony. Leisure suggests choice, spontaneity, pleasure. What happens next is the closest approximation of freedom that exists within these walls. The men form columns again, this time with different energy. The morning march was dutiful. This march carries anticipation. 40 minutes lie ahead when the rules loosen slightly, when voices are permitted. The recreation facility is separate, a dedicated space with high ceilings. Ping pong tables stand at one end. Board game stations occupy another. A small television sits in a corner. But before any activity begins, there is the warm-up. Just as the workday started with calisthenics, so too does leisure time. The warm-up is shorter, perhaps 2 minutes, and less vigorous. The men stretch their arms, roll their shoulders, bend at the waist. Some of them are smiling, just slightly. Then they are released. Within the boundaries of the room and the rules that govern it, the men are allowed to choose. They can play ping pong or board games. They can watch television. They can talk without raising their hands for permission. The ping pong tables fill first. There is something appealing about the game, its simplicity and speed. The men play with intensity, their competitive instincts emerging. They serve and volley, their bodies moving with athleticism. Others choose board games. Shogi is popular among older inmates. Younger men prefer simpler games, card games, or dice games that rely more on chance. The television draws a smaller crowd. The content is controlled. Game shows, nature documentaries, historical programs, no news, nothing current. Among the offerings is karaoke. Men take turns singing, their voices tentative at first, then growing bolder. They sing pop songs from their youth, ballads about lost love. They sing traditional melodies. Some sing well, others sing poorly, but they sing anyway because for these few minutes, performance is allowed, self-expression is tolerated. The guards watch, but do not interfere unless someone violates a clear rule. This controlled chaos serves the institution's purposes. It provides a release valve, a brief outlet for energies that might otherwise build dangerously, and it passes too quickly, always too quickly. The men track the minutes as they disappear. 20 minutes left, 15, 10. The games become more urgent. When the whistle sounds, there is no protest. The paddles are set down mid-game. The cards are gathered. The television is turned off. The men stand, form their columns, and prepare to march back to the factories. They do not complain because complaining is not tolerated, and because they know that tomorrow, if they behave, the 40 minutes will come again. It is something to work toward, a small light in the regulated darkness. 40 minutes is not much, but here it is everything. A voice from inside. He's 27 years old. His crime, theft. His sentence, 3 years. He sits before us with 2 guards watching, silent and severe. He was given permission to speak, and in that permission, a story emerges, or rather, the carefully edited outline of a story. The room is an office in the administrative wing where paperwork is processed. It has a desk, chairs, and a filing cabinet. Compared to the austere living quarters, this room feels almost luxurious in its ordinariness. He enters escorted by guards, one on each side. He walks with his head slightly lowered, from the posture trained into him through months of protocols that demand deference. He is dressed in the standard grey uniform, his head shaved. Without hair or personal clothing, he could be anyone. Only the number on his chest distinguishes him. The guards take positions by the door, their arms at their sides. Their presence is supervisory, a reminder that this conversation is not private. Everything said will be heard, noted. The young man sits, his hands resting on his thighs, his eyes focused on a point in the middle distance. He has been told he can speak, and that he has been selected to represent 900 inmates. The interview begins. How long has he been here? How much time remains? The answers come slowly, from careful consideration. He weighs each sentence before releasing it. He is serving 3 years for theft. The details of the crime are not elaborated. Perhaps the guards instructed him not to discuss it. Perhaps he prefers not to revisit the moment that brought him here. The crime itself matters less than its consequence. 1.5 years remain. He has reached the midpoint, that psychological milestone where the balance tips and what was once distant begins to feel conceivable. When asked about daily life, he describes the routines observed throughout the prison. The early wake-up, the cleaning, the march to the factory. He speaks not with complaint, but with resigned acceptance. But then he speaks of adaptation, how the mind adjusts to confinement in surprising ways. How in the first weeks, every hour felt like a day, but gradually the rhythm took hold. The body learned when to wake without the music. The self became synchronized with the institution's schedule, and time paradoxically began to move more quickly. He talks about the work, the factory where he spends his days assembling products he will never own. The labor is monotonous, he admits, but it provides structure, and structure he has come to value. Outside, his life was chaotic. The prison has imposed a framework, and within it, he has found a strange kind of peace. The guards shift slightly. Perhaps they are concerned about the direction of the conversation. But he continues, carefully navigating invisible boundaries. He speaks of the other inmates, though not by name, the older men whose faces have become part of the prison, the younger ones, like himself, who struggle with lost years. Some are angry, others are sad. And some seem genuinely changed, who claim prison has saved them from worse trajectories. When the interview concludes, he is escorted back to his wing. The guards thank him with formal politeness. He nods and leaves. What remains is a portrait, incomplete and carefully edited, of a life in suspension. Whether he is better or worse for the experience, whether he will emerge reformed or simply more careful, these questions have no answers yet. But for now, the day continues. Evening approaches with its routines that wind down towards sleep. Throughout the prison, the men return from their final shifts. They wash, change into evening clothing, eat dinners portioned with the same care as lunch. Then comes study time. Some attend classes, others study independently, working through correspondence courses or reading books from the prison library. The atmosphere is quiet but not silent. It is perhaps the most peaceful hour of the day. At precisely 7 o'clock, the television turns on. This is automated, programmed into the system. The programming is limited and controlled. Game shows, variety programs, educational content, nothing controversial. At 9 o'clock, the television turns off. Lights out follows shortly after. The men lie on their futons. The mountain night presses against the walls. Inside, 900 men close their eyes and wait for sleep. And one among them, a young man of 27 with 18 months remaining, stares at the ceiling and counts the days. The ghost in the machine. Carlos Ghosn stood before the world on January 8th, 2020, a free man in Beirut. But in Tokyo, they called him something else, a fugitive. His escape had shocked a nation. His words would shock them further. The Lebanese capital sprawled beneath a winter sky. Beirut had seen many things in its long history, but it had rarely seen anything quite like this. a gathering of international press assembled to hear one man's accusation against an entire judicial system. The venue was the press union. Outside, excitement built as camera crews arrived, as reporters checked their equipment, as the world's attention focused on this single point. There was a notable absence. Japanese media had been invited, but at the door, they were turned away. This was Carlos Ghosn's stage, and he would control who watched from the wings. Inside, the hall filled with bodies and equipment. Seats were arranged facing a podium where microphones had been positioned with care. This was theatre as much as journalism. And then he entered. Carlos Ghosn, once among the most powerful executives in the global automotive industry, walked to the podium with the bearing of someone who had never doubted his right to be there. He wore a suit, dark and well-tailored, projecting authority. His expression was serious, but controlled. He had been preparing for this moment, perhaps for months. Camera flashes erupted like small stars. The sound was almost musical. He stood at the podium and looked out. This was his moment. This was his chance to speak without the constraints placed on him in Tokyo, without guards watching, without prosecutors editing. He began by organizing the proceedings himself, pointing to journalists, calling on them by name or nationality, directing the flow of questions. Even here, he could not resist asserting control. The first question came, then another. He answered with practiced fluency. He was innocent. He had been persecuted. The Japanese justice system was not just flawed, but fundamentally corrupt, designed to coerce confession, to break individuals who dared to challenge it. He spoke of November 2018, when his life as he knew it ended. He had been arrested in Tokyo, taken into custody at the airport immediately after his private jet landed. Concealing income, they said. Embezzlement. Amounts reaching into tens of millions of euros. The allegations were complex, involving years of financial transactions. For prosecutors, these complexities provided evidence of deliberate deception. For Ghosn, they were routine business practices, misunderstood or deliberately misinterpreted. He did not spend this press conference defending himself point by point. That would have been tedious. Instead, he attacked the process. The Japanese system, he argued, was inherently unjust. He spoke of the 400 days he had endured in detention. 400 days held away from family, from legal counsel of his choosing, from basic dignities. 400 days of interrogation and isolation. 400 days was not an abstraction. It was more than a year. It was birthdays missed and holidays spent in a cell. It was time, that most precious resource, taken from him not after conviction, but before. And then came the line that would be quoted in every report. "I did not escape justice," he said, his eyes meeting the cameras directly. "I fled injustice and persecution, political persecution." The words hung in the air. They were an indictment not just of prosecutors, but of Japan itself. He continued. The treatment he had endured was inhumane, he said. The system was designed to break people, to wear them down until confession seemed like the only path to relief, even for those who had committed no crime. And because he would not confess, he had been denied even minimal justice. Bail requests rejected, trial delayed indefinitely, evidence kept secret. In the front row, his wife Carol listened and nodded. She had stood by him throughout, visiting when permitted, advocating in the media. When questions turned to her, she spoke with passion. Her husband had been tortured, she said, not with physical violence, but with psychological pressure, with grinding uncertainty of indefinite detention. The press conference lasted hours, the same themes repeated from different angles until they became not just Carlos Ghosn's story, but the accepted narrative among many international observers. But even as Carlos Ghosn spoke in Beirut, another press conference was being prepared 10,000 kilometers away. In Tokyo, in the Ministry of Justice, officials were gathering their own responses. The contrast would be stark. Where Carlos Ghosn filled a hall with international media, the Japanese response would be quieter, more formal, less accessible to foreign observers. The minister herself would speak, her anger carefully controlled but visible. She would not name Carlos Ghosn directly, but her meaning would be clear. He had violated the laws of Japan. His escape was not courage, but cowardice. Two narratives, two perspectives, two versions of reality. In Beirut, Carlos Ghosn presented himself as a victim. In Tokyo, prosecutors presented him as a criminal who had confirmed his guilt by running. The press conference ended. The journalists dispersed. Carlos Ghosn left the podium, his mission accomplished. He had told his story. He had positioned himself carefully in the court of public opinion. He was free in Lebanon, yes, but he was also trapped there, unable to travel to most countries without risking extradition. The escape had saved him from Japanese prison, but it had created a different kind of prison, one with invisible walls that would follow him wherever he went. A minister's answer. 10,000 kilometers away, in Tokyo's Ministry of Justice, another press conference unfolds. This one is quieter. No flashing cameras, no foreign press. The minister speaks with measured anger. Japan, she says, will defend its system. The building is modern but understated, rising among Tokyo's government districts without calling attention to itself. Inside, a conference room has been prepared, smaller than the hall in Beirut. The walls neutral, the lighting fluorescent. The Japanese media are present, representatives from major newspapers and television networks. They sit with notebooks, waiting with patient professionalism. Foreign journalists are notably absent. This press conference will not have the global audience that Carlos Ghosn commanded. It will be a domestic affair, a message delivered primarily to the Japanese people. The Minister of Justice enters with her staff. She is dressed in a dark suit. Her expression serious. She carries the authority of her office and the weight of a system under attack. She does not waste time with pleasantries. The statement she delivers is prepared, her voice steady and clear. She speaks in Japanese, her words directed at her fellow citizens. She does not mention Carlos Ghosn by name. This is deliberate. To speak his name would be to grant him continued importance. Instead, she speaks of a defendant who fled justice, of someone who violated trust when released on bail, of an individual who chose to reject the legal process. Her anger surfaces quietly, a slight tightening of her jaw, a pause before certain words, an edge in her tone that listeners trained in Japanese nuances can detect. She speaks of respect for law, of the importance of trust in maintaining social order. When someone is granted bail, she explains, it is a privilege extended on the understanding that the accused will honor obligations. To betray that trust is a philosophical violation. The defense that follows is not apologetic. There is no acknowledgement that reforms might be needed. Instead, the minister presents the system as it is understood within Japan, as a mechanism that works precisely because it is rigorous, demanding, and unwilling to compromise standards. She speaks of crime rates. Japan has one of the lowest in the world. Violent crime is rare. Theft occurs at levels that would seem utopian to policymakers in most nations. The number of prisoners, compared proportionally to population, is 4 times lower than France, 6 times lower than the United States. Japanese prisons are not bursting. In recent years, they have actually been emptying. This success did not happen by accident. It is the result of a system that takes crime seriously, that treats punishment as correction and rehabilitation. The discipline that Carlos Ghosn finds harsh is precisely what makes the system work. She speaks of values, of principles that most Japanese learn from childhood: respect for authority, commitment to the group over the individual, understanding that personal desires must sometimes be subordinated to collective needs. In such a society, the prison system becomes an extension of broader educational and correctional processes that begin long before anyone commits a crime. For foreigners arrested in Japan, she acknowledges, the system can seem incomprehensible. They come from cultures with different values, different assumptions about individual rights. They expect certain procedures, and when these are absent or take different forms, they interpret this as injustice rather than cultural difference. But Japan is not required to conform to foreign expectations. It is a sovereign nation with its own legal traditions. The system may be strict by international standards, but it is not arbitrary. The press conference continues with questions, though the questions are deferential, phrased carefully to avoid direct challenge. The minister answers with the same measured tone, reiterating the same themes. The system works. The statistics prove it. As the press conference concludes, the message has been delivered clearly. Japan stands behind its system. It does not seek to impose that system on other nations, but neither will it abandon it in response to external pressure. The contrast with Beirut could not be more complete. Where Carlos Ghosn performed for a global audience, Tokyo spoke to itself. Where he deployed emotion, the ministry offered statistics. Where he positioned himself as a victim, Japan positioned itself as a nation unjustly accused. But beyond the press conferences, the reality remains. In Nagano, 900 men continue their routines. They wake to classical music, they clean their cells, they march to factories. The system that Carlos Ghosn fled and that Japan defends continues operating exactly as it has, indifferent to international debate. The goal has always been order, not chaotic freedom, not individual expression, but order, discipline, harmony. Zero crime, the minister had said. Zero tolerance. These are aspirations, but the direction matters. To aim for zero is to commit fully to the effort. And so the system continues. The prisons maintain their routines. The guards enforce their regulations. The inmates move through their days shaped by forces larger than any individual will. In the international arena, the debate will continue. Carlos Ghosn will give more interviews. Japanese officials will occasionally respond, though more often they will simply ignore him. But in Nagano, none of this debate penetrates the walls. The machine runs on, patient and implacable, indifferent to the noise beyond its boundaries. Order must be maintained, discipline must be preserved, and tomorrow will begin exactly like today. The man who stated his name is Mark Karpeles. He is 35 years old, a computer genius with Asperger's syndrome. He spent 11 months in Japanese custody. And when they released him, he did something strange. He stayed. The story begins with technology and money, and the seductive promise that both can be mastered by those clever enough. Mark Karpeles was such a person, or believed himself to be. He had grown up in France, a quiet child who found computers intuitive, their logic clear in ways human behavior never was. He discovered programming early, writing code that solved problems or simply pleased him with its elegance. The screen became his window to a world that made sense. In his 20s, he discovered Bitcoin. The cryptocurrency was new then, understood by only a small community who saw in its decentralized architecture a revolutionary alternative to traditional banking. For someone like Mark Karpeles, Bitcoin was beautiful. It was also potentially lucrative. As interest grew, exchanges emerged to facilitate transactions. Mark Karpeles moved to Japan and took control of one such exchange, a platform called Mt. Gox. Under his leadership, it grew rapidly, at one point handling more than 70% of all Bitcoin transactions worldwide. He became wealthy. He lived well, better than he had ever imagined. And then it collapsed. In February 2014, Mt. Gox suddenly stopped processing withdrawals. Users found themselves unable to access their funds. Days passed. The silence grew ominous. And then came the announcement that would transform him from entrepreneur to scandal. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin had disappeared. Mt. Gox filed for bankruptcy. Mark Karpeles was forced to explain, to face the anger of thousands who had trusted him with their money. He held a press conference, a public apology performed according to Japanese custom. He bowed deeply, his body folding at the waist. Cameras captured the moment, this ritual of shame. But apologies do not recover lost money. And soon questions arose. Where has Bitcoin gone? Had Mark Karpeles himself been complicit? The investigation began. Japanese authorities, already suspicious of cryptocurrency, focused their attention on Mt. Gox. They examined records, traced transactions, and interviewed employees. Mark Karpeles, they concluded, had not merely been negligent. He had been a criminal. Specific transactions were identified where funds appeared diverted for personal use. The nightmare began with his arrest. It was August 2015. Japanese police arrived without warning. The arrest was quiet, professional. He was taken into custody and informed he would be held while the investigation continued. 4 months he spent in initial detention. He was questioned repeatedly, sessions lasting hours, investigators pressing him to explain transactions, to confess to crimes they were convinced he had committed. For someone with Asperger's syndrome, the experience was particularly traumatic. Social cues that others might read intuitively were invisible to him. He answered questions literally, failing to understand that cooperation can be interpreted as admission. Then he was transferred to Kosuge prison. Here, the true weight of the Japanese system revealed itself. The rules that seemed merely strict in description became instruments of psychological pressure when experienced hour after hour. In Kosuge, prisoners awaiting trial did not work. This might seem like mercy, but work provides structure. Without it, days become formless. Mark Karpeles was placed in solitary confinement, not as punishment for specific infractions, but as standard procedure for foreign defendants. He lived in a small cell, alone, with no human contact except guards. The isolation was complete. He was allowed no books at times, no writing materials. The cell contained a toilet, a place to sleep, and nothing else. Time stopped having meaning. Morning and night were distinguished only by the quality of light filtering through the small window. Days blurred into weeks. He stopped being able to track them accurately. The psychological term for what he experienced is depersonalization, a sense of disconnection from one's own body and thoughts. And then came the punishment. The details of what rule he broke are less important than what followed. He was taken to the padded cell, a space even smaller than his regular confinement. He was tied, his movements restricted, his body held in position for 4 hours. Not beaten, not physically abused, but controlled, rendered completely powerless. When the 4 hours ended, when he was returned to his cell, the punishment continued. 4 days without books, without writing materials, without anything but walls and thoughts spiraling in patterns that became less coherent. 11 months. That is how long Mark Karpeles spent in Japanese custody before his trial finally concluded. When the verdict came, it was mixed. He was declared innocent of embezzlement, the most serious charge. The prosecutors had not proven he stole the missing Bitcoin for personal gain. But he was given a suspended sentence on another charge, data manipulation. Guilty but not imprisoned, free but not innocent. He walked out of Kosuge prison into Tokyo streets, blinking in sunlight that seemed too bright, overwhelmed by noise and color and chaos. And then came the decision that puzzled everyone. Mark Karpeles did not leave Japan. He did not return to France. He stayed. When asked why, his explanations were complex. He spoke of unfinished business, of obligations to former users who still sought recovery. He spoke of his life being in Japan now, his connections and routine. But perhaps there was something else, a sense that running would be admission. By staying, by continuing to live in the country that had imprisoned him, he maintained a kind of defiance. He sits now in a restaurant, eating a meal that would have seemed impossibly luxurious during his time in custody. He eats slowly, savoring each bite in a way he never did before. He is 35, but looks older, his face carrying the marks of stress. His eyes are watchful, never quite relaxed, scanning the room with wariness. He lives quietly now, no longer the center of attention, just a man trying to build a life from ruins. But Mark Karpeles endures. He survived what many could not. And in his decision to remain, there is a testament to human resilience. He is free now, as free as anyone with his history can be. But the cell will never completely release him. It lives in memory, in dreams, in reflexive fear when doors close, or when he finds himself alone in small spaces. The prison is gone. The prisoner remains. The padded cell 4 hours. That is how long Mark Karpeles spent, tied up in an empty, padded cell. No explanation, no end in sight. Then came punishment. 4 days without books, without paper, without anything but walls and time. Kosuge prison sits in eastern Tokyo, surrounded by ordinary neighborhoods. People pass its walls daily without giving much thought to what happens within. For those held inside, The difference between awaiting judgment and serving sentence often blurs into irrelevance. The walls are the same. The separation from the outside world is equally complete. The architecture reflects its purpose. The cells are smaller than those in facilities where convicted inmates work. Here, the emphasis is on containment, on holding people securely while the legal process grinds forward. The process can take months, sometimes years. For those who wait, who maintain their innocence, the detention becomes its own form of punishment. Mark Karpeles lived in solitary confinement. This was not unusual for foreign defendants. The logic was security, but the result was isolation. The cell was small, perhaps 6 tatami mats in the area. The walls were concrete, painted in that institutional color between gray and beige. A small window near the ceiling admitted light, but was positioned too high to see through. The furniture consisted of a thin futon rolled out at night, a small shelf for toiletries. Nothing else. Books were sometimes allowed, sometimes confiscated, depending on factors that were never entirely clear. For someone whose mind worked like Mark Karpeles, someone who needed structure and predictability. The arbitrary nature of the rules was perhaps more difficult than the rules themselves. The days had no shape. In prisons where inmates work, the schedule provides structure. In Kosuga, awaiting trial, there was no work. The days were empty, vast expanses of time that had to be filled with something to prevent the mind from turning inward and consuming itself. Mark Karpeles tried to maintain routines. He would wake at approximately the same time, perform stretches, eat breakfast, then sit and think or pace until lunch arrived. The challenge was psychological, finding ways to occupy consciousness for 16 waking hours with almost no external input. The isolation worked on him slowly. In the first weeks, he maintained his sense of self. He thought about his defense, mentally reviewing evidence. He thought about Mount Gox, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events. But as weeks became months, his thoughts began to change character. They became less focused, more circular, returning obsessively to the same questions without finding answers. The questions repeated like mantras, wearing grooves in his consciousness. He began to lose track of time, not just forgetting what day it was, but in a deeper way. The present moment stretched until it seemed to encompass everything. The past felt distant and unreal. The future was equally abstract. There was only now, only this cell, only the waiting. Sleep became difficult. The body, deprived of physical exhaustion from work, did not tire in normal ways. He would lie on his futon staring at the ceiling, his mind racing, unable to quiet itself enough for sleep to come. And then came the punishment that would mark him more deeply than all the rest. The infraction was minor, or perhaps not an infraction at all. Perhaps simply a misunderstanding born of his difficulty reading social cues. He was taken from his cell by 2 guards. They led him through corridors he had not seen before, into sections where the architecture became more clinical. The padded cell was unlike his regular space. The walls were covered in thick material, soft to touch, but firm beneath. The floor was similarly padded. There was nothing else. They positioned him in the center and bound his arms and legs, not with handcuffs, but with restraints designed for this purpose, straps that held him immobile. Then they left, leaving him alone in the padded silence. 4 hours. Time in such circumstances does not flow normally. Minutes feel like hours. The body, unable to move, begins to ache. Muscles cramp. Joints protest. The urge to shift position becomes overwhelming, but movement is impossible. The mind, deprived of sensory input, begins to generate its own. He saw patterns in the padded walls. He heard sounds that might have been his own breathing or might have been something else. The boundary between perception and hallucination became uncertain. When they finally released him, he could barely walk. His legs would not support him properly. They left him on the floor of his cell, and he lay there, his body slowly recovering function, his mind struggling to process what had happened. But the punishment was not complete. For the next 4 days, all privileges were revoked. The books he had been allowed, removed. The writing materials, confiscated. The small radio, taken away. He was left with nothing but the cell and his thoughts. 4 days that stretched into eternity. He emerged from those 4 days, changed. Something in him had broken. Some capacity for hope or resistance. Now he simply endured, existing from moment to moment, without a larger narrative or purpose. 11 months, from arrest to trial. 11 months of this existence. When his trial finally came, proceedings were brief. The prosecutors presented their case. His lawyers presented their defense. And then came the verdict. Not guilty of embezzlement. The main charge was dismissed. The evidence did not support it. He felt something like relief. Not guilty. The words meant something. But the relief was incomplete. There was another charge, smaller, related to data manipulation. On this offense, the court found him guilty. He was given a suspended sentence. He was free, technically, free to leave the courtroom, to walk into Tokyo's streets. But he was also guilty, marked permanently with a conviction. The irony was complete. He had been held for 11 months, subjected to conditions that destroyed his mental health, all in service of a process that ultimately determined he had not committed the crime they most seriously accused him of. But the system could not admit complete error. It found him guilty of something to maintain the fiction that justice had been served. He walked out of Kosuge, carrying that contradiction, innocent of the main charge, but guilty in the eyes of the law. The prison authorities, when they opened their doors to journalists, showed clean facilities and orderly procedures. Everything was presented as evidence of a system that worked. Mark Karpeles knew differently. He knew what happened in the padded cells that were not shown to cameras. He knew what solitary confinement did to a mind over months. He knew the gap between official narrative and lived experience. And yet, he stayed, made his life in Japan despite everything, tried to build something from the ruins, knowing that the past would always be present, that the cell was gone, but his shadow would follow him. The verdict was final. The sentence was suspended. But the punishment, in its way, would never truly end. A festival at the gates of hell. Once a year, 10,000 people gather outside Kosuge prison. They come with their children. They come smiling. There's music, cotton candy, and laughter. They're here to celebrate a prison. The morning begins with preparations. Vendors arrive early, unloading equipment, assembling stalls for food and souvenirs. Sound systems are tested, stages positioned to provide optimal sightlines. The architecture itself is impressive. Kosuge prison is built in an X shape, 4 wings radiating from a central hub. From above, the building looks like a geometric symbol, precise and intentional. The walls are high but not medieval. This is a modern correctional facility. But for one day each year, those walls become backdrop to something that would seem impossible in most countries, a celebration of incarceration. By mid-morning, the crowds begin to arrive. Families mostly, parents with children excited for a day out. The adults come with different motivations. Some are curious, others come with civic pride. And some come without thinking deeply, simply following tradition. 10,000 people. This is not a small gathering. This is a major public event, covered by media, promoted through official channels. The entertainment begins shortly after gates open. On the main stage, a pop star performs. She is not famous by national standards, but she has a following, and her presence lends the event normalcy. She sings upbeat songs, her voice amplified across the grounds. The crowd gathers, some dancing, others watching. The music is cheerful, designed to generate positive feelings, and it succeeds. People smile, they clap along, they take photographs. Between musical performances, other shows cycle through. Comedy acts, traditional dancers. Law enforcement officers take the stage to perform a demonstration, showing how they subdue uncooperative individuals, how they apply restraints. The demonstration is presented as educational. The officers work through their routine with practiced precision. The techniques are efficient, effective. The audience watches with interest. When the demonstration concludes, the officers bow. The audience applauds. The line between entertainment and reality blurs. But perhaps the most popular attraction is the opportunity to taste prison food. A section has been set up as a dining area where volunteers ladle curry and rice onto trays for visitors who have paid a small fee. The curry is the signature dish of Japanese prisons, served regularly as an efficient, nutritious meal. It is not gourmet food, but it is not terrible either. The price is modest, 300 yen, roughly $3. And yet, people wait. The line extends for dozens of meters, families standing patiently for their turn. When they finally receive their trays, they eat with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some find it surprisingly good. Others grimace and leave portions unfinished. Children tend to eat readily, untroubled by context. The festival presents an ideal image of the prison system, a carefully curated vision of order and fairness. Visitors see friendly guards posing for photographs. They see clean facilities. They see products made by inmates displayed with pride. Only one person seems disturbed by all of this. Thomas Solius stands among the crowds, his expression troubled. He is Lithuanian, though he has lived in Japan long enough to understand the language and navigate the culture. He came to this country years ago, married a Japanese woman, had a daughter he loved with intensity that bordered on pain. Then came the divorce, and with it, a reality he had not anticipated. In Japan, when marriages dissolve and children are involved, the legal system generally grants custody to one parent absolutely. Not shared custody, not visitation rights. Thomas lost access to his daughter entirely. His ex-wife decided he could not see her, and the Japanese courts supported that decision. Desperate, isolated from his child, Thomas had done something foolish. He attempted to take her. The law called it kidnapping. He was arrested, spent 6 months in Kosuge prison, and emerged broken, his relationship with his daughter irrevocably damaged. Now he walks through the festival, and his presence serves as counterpoint to the celebration. When he speaks, his voice carries disbelief and anger carefully modulated. "Why would you create a festival in a prison?" he asks. "It's a prison. What kind of message does this send? What kind of society celebrates the place where people lose their freedom?" He watches children eating cotton candy. He sees parents taking selfies with prison guards. "The brainwashing," he says. "It's like they've been conditioned to see this as normal, as good. They're teaching their children that prisons are places to celebrate, that authority is always right." He pauses near one of the stalls where products made by inmates are being sold. Leather goods, carefully crafted, furniture, wooden pieces made with traditional joinery, shoes, comfortable-looking footwear. The prices are reasonable. This is part of the appeal. They get quality goods at a discount, and they get the story behind them. Thomas looks at the shoes. "This is way better than anything I saw in there," he says quietly. In the prison, the conditions were nothing like what they're showing here. This is all for show, all performance. He sees the curry line. "This curry," he says. "Believe me, they do not give you this kind of curry. What they serve inside is nothing like this. The real prison food is bland, minimal." But no one around him seems to hear. The festival continues, the music plays, the children laugh, and the 10,000 visitors enjoy their day. The festival is genius as public relations. It humanizes the guards. It normalizes the prison. It presents incarceration as a necessary social function, even praiseworthy. And for those who support the system, the festival provides confirmation. They see clean facilities, productive inmates, and dedicated staff. They conclude that the system works. Thomas stands apart from this satisfaction, isolated by his knowledge of what the festival does not show. He knows the solitary cells, the interrogation rooms, the long months of psychological pressure. But he is one voice among 10,000. The narrative that will persist is the one the festival creates. The sun moves across the sky. The afternoon wears on. The crowds will disperse, returning to their lives, and Kosuge prison will return to its regular function. The walls will still stand. The cells will still hold their occupants. The system will continue grinding forward. Thomas walks toward the exit, tired and troubled. Behind him, the music plays on. The contradiction is complete. The festival is a success. Hostage justice. In Japan, there is a term that lawyers whisper in corridors: hostage justice. It means this: if you deny the accusation, your custody extends, and extends, and extends, until you confess, whether you are guilty or not. The phrase itself is revealing, chosen by those who have observed the system from positions of knowledge and growing concern. Lawyers use it. Human rights advocates repeat it. Foreigners arrested in Japan learn it quickly. Hostage justice. The words capture something essential about how the Japanese criminal process operates. At its core, the concept is simple. In most democratic legal systems, detention before trial is meant to be brief and justified by clear concerns: flight risk, danger to the community, risk of evidence tampering. But in Japan, the calculation runs differently. Detention is not the exception but the norm for those accused of serious crimes, and the duration can be extended repeatedly, almost indefinitely, particularly if the accused maintains their innocence. The system is designed, critics say, to extract compliance rather than determine truth. Prosecutors build their cases around confessions, viewing them as the most reliable form of evidence. A confession signed by the accused, read aloud in court, acknowledged as true. This is the foundation upon which convictions are built, and the reason Japan's conviction rate hovers near 99%. For those who confess quickly, the process can move with surprising speed. Trials are brief, sentences pronounced. But for those who refuse to confess, who maintain innocence, the process becomes something else entirely. A test of will. A war of attrition. Carlos Ghosn entered this system on November 19th, 2018. The date marks the moment when his life as he had known it ended. He arrived at Tokyo's Haneda Airport aboard his private jet, expecting nothing unusual. The plane touched down, the door opened, and waiting on the tarmac were prosecutors and police. They boarded the aircraft, surrounded him before he fully understood what was happening, and informed him of the charges: concealing income, financial misconduct, amounts reaching into tens of millions of dollars. He was taken into custody immediately, transferred from the luxury of his private jet to the custody of the state in minutes. There was no time to contact lawyers, to arrange affairs. He simply disappeared from public view. The detention facility was a place designed to hold those awaiting trial. He was placed in a cell, small and sparse, and there he would remain for 108 days before seeing the inside of a courtroom. 108 days, more than 3 months. A full season passes from autumn into winter. Outside, the world continued, but inside, time moved differently for Carlos Ghosn, each day a repetition of the last. The interrogations were relentless. Japanese law allows prosecutors to question suspects for hours each day, sessions extending 8 hours or more, conducted without defense lawyers present, without video recording to document what is said. For someone like Carlos Ghosn, accustomed to being the one asking questions, the experience was disorienting and infuriating. He could not dictate terms. He could not end sessions when he grew tired. He could only respond, defend, deny, repeating his innocence hour after hour, knowing that his refusal was extending his detention. After 108 days, he was finally brought before a court for a bail hearing. It was his first public appearance since arrest. Carlos Ghosn entered, wearing clothes provided by the facility, plain and institutional. His appearance shocked those who knew him. He had lost weight. His face looked drawn, aged beyond the months that had passed. His lawyers argued for bail, presenting evidence that he was not a flight risk. The court listened, considered, and denied the request. The reasons given were standard: better to keep him detained. Carlos Ghosn returned to his cell. The detention would continue, though eventually a second bail request would be granted, allowing him to leave under strict conditions. When that release finally came, he did so wearing a disguise his lawyers had concocted. He dressed as a worker, wearing a uniform and cap. The disguise fooled no one. The press recognized him immediately. Here was a man who had once moved freely through the world's capitals, reduced to sneaking out wearing a false identity. But his release was temporary. Japanese prosecutors possess a tool that prosecutors in many countries do not: the ability to split charges into separate cases, to arrest someone multiple times for different aspects of the same alleged conduct. Carlos Ghosn experienced this directly. On April 11th, 2019, just as he was preparing to hold a press conference, prosecutors arrested him again on new charges. Back into detention he went. This second arrest lasted 22 days, but the damage was done, the message sent clearly. He could not plan, he could not speak freely. At any moment, prosecutors could find another charge. The psychological toll of this uncertainty is difficult to overstate. It is not simply the hardship of detention itself, but the not knowing, the inability to plan beyond the immediate present. This is what hostage justice means in practice. The state holds your freedom and offers it back in exchange for confession. And if you refuse, you pay the price in time and uncertainty, in months or years of limbo. The statistics bear this out. Conviction rates in Japan exceed 99%. The number becomes comprehensible when one understands how cases reach trial. Those who confess are convicted based on their own admissions. Those who maintain innocence but have weak defenses are convicted based on other evidence, and those who might actually be innocent often confess anyway, worn down by detention. The system's defenders argue that it works, that the high conviction rate reflects careful case selection. But critics point to cases like Keiko Aoki, held for decades for a crime she did not commit. They point to foreign defendants confused by cultural differences and ground down by processes they could not navigate. Carlos Ghosn understood this eventually. He saw the pattern and recognized that his detention could be extended indefinitely. It was this understanding that would lead him to make the choice that shocked the world. But that escape was still months away. For now, he remained in Tokyo, living under bail conditions, preparing for a trial that might never come in any form he would consider fair. The hostages were not always held in cells. Sometimes they walked the streets, wore their own clothes, but they were hostages nonetheless, held by the state's power to reclaim them at any moment. The system had all the time in the world. The accused had none at all. The woman who lost everything. Every week, Keiko Aoki places flowers where her daughter passed. The fire took her child 21 years ago. The prison system took the rest of her life. She was innocent. It did not matter. The house stood in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where children played in streets without much supervision, where neighbors knew each other's names and looked out for one another in the casual way that communities do when they function well. It was modest, built in the years after the war when Japan was reconstructing itself, when homes were practical rather than grand, designed to shelter families without pretense or excess. Keiko Aoki lived there with her partner and their 2 children, a son and a daughter. The daughter was 11 years old, poised at that threshold between childhood and adolescence, still young enough to need her mother, but old enough to dream of independence. She was a good student, her teacher said, quiet but thoughtful, the kind of child who caused no trouble, who did her homework without complaint, who helped with household chores and looked after her younger brother when asked. The fire came at night, in the hours when sleep is deepest, when the body's defenses are lowest, when smoke can fill rooms before consciousness returns enough to recognize danger. The exact cause will be disputed later, analyzed by investigators and experts, argued over in courtrooms and reports. But in the moment, In the chaos of flame and heat and the animal panic of waking to disaster, causes mattered less than escape. Keiko Aoki woke to smoke. Not the pleasant smoke of cooking or incense, but something thicker, darker, carrying the chemical tang of burning synthetic materials, of plastics and fabrics releasing toxic compounds as they combusted. She could not see clearly, could not think clearly, could only react with the desperate urgency of a mother whose children are in danger. She found her son first. His room was closer, or perhaps the smoke had not yet penetrated as deeply there. Or perhaps it was simply luck. That arbitrary force that determines who lives and who experiences their final moments when disaster strikes without warning or fairness. She grabbed him, pulled him from his bed, carried him through corridors that were filled with smoke, downstairs that felt unfamiliar in the darkness and confusion, out into the night air where neighbors were gathering, drawn by the growing light of flames, by the sound of breaking glass and collapsing structure. She set her son down, made sure he was breathing, then turned to go back inside. Her daughter was still in there, still in her room, and Keiko Aoki was not the kind of mother who would leave a child behind, who would stand in safety while her daughter remained in danger. But the house was changing rapidly, the fire growing, consuming more rooms, more materials, producing more smoke and heat with each passing second. Neighbors grabbed her, held her back, told her it was too late, that she could not go back in, that the risk was too great. She fought them, screamed her daughter's name, tried to break free from the hands that restrained her with good intentions and the terrible logic of survival. But they were right, even if she could not accept it. The house was lost, and her daughter, somewhere inside, was beyond reach. The firefighters arrived, worked through the night, controlled the blaze eventually, and searched the ruins. They found her in her room, overcome by smoke before the flames reached her. A small mercy, perhaps, though mercy is a strange word to use for any passing of a child. Keiko Aoki held her daughter's body when they brought her out, held her and wept with a grief so profound it seemed to have no bottom, no limit, no end. She had lost the most precious thing in her life, lost it despite her efforts, despite her love, despite the fact that she had tried to go back, had been willing to risk everything to save her child. That should have been the end of the story in any just world. A tragedy, yes, a loss that would mark her forever, but an accident, one of those terrible events that happen without intention or fault, reminds us how fragile life is, how quickly it can be taken. But the police did not see it that way. From the beginning, from the first investigations amid the smoking wreckage, they suspected something else. Not an accident, but a crime. Not tragedy, but conspiracy. The reasoning, as it was eventually explained, had a certain logic to it. The kind of logic that seems reasonable until examined closely. Fires happen. Sometimes they are accidents caused by electrical faults or unattended stoves or any of 1,000 small failures that can ignite catastrophe. But sometimes they are deliberate, set by arsonists who seek to destroy property, to cover evidence of other crimes, or to collect insurance money from policies that suddenly become valuable when buildings burn. In Keiko Aoki's case, there was an insurance policy, not an unusual one, not suspicious in its amounts or terms, simply the standard coverage that homeowners purchase to protect against loss, to ensure that if disaster strikes, they will not be left homeless and destitute. But to investigators looking for motive, the policy became evidence. Here was a reason to set the fire. Here was what they needed to transform an accident into crime. They looked at her daughter's passing and saw not tragedy, but calculation. A child sacrificed for money, a mother willing to let her daughter experience her final moments, or perhaps even actively causing that outcome, to collect insurance payments that would amount to a relatively modest sum. Nothing that could justify such horror, but apparently sufficient in the investigators' minds to explain what had happened. The interrogations began shortly after the funeral, before Keiko Aoki had even begun to process her grief, before she had found any way to function in a world where her daughter no longer existed. Police came to question her, to ask about the insurance policy, about her financial situation, about her relationship with her partner, about anything that might reveal motive or opportunity or consciousness of guilt. She told them the truth, that the fire had been an accident, that she had tried to save her daughter, that the idea she would harm her own child was monstrous beyond comprehension. But truth, in the machinery of Japanese criminal justice, is not always sufficient defense. What matters more is confession, admission, the defendant's own words acknowledging wrongdoing. And so they pressed her. Day after day, session after session, the same questions asked in different ways, the same suspicions voiced from different angles. They told her that the evidence pointed to arson. They told her that her partner was talking and was saying things that implicated her, though whether this was true or a technique to encourage confession was never entirely clear. They told her that things would go easier if she simply admitted what she had done, that continuing to deny would only make her situation worse. She was exhausted, grieving, operating on almost no sleep in the weeks since the fire. Her mind was not functioning normally, could not function normally under such circumstances. And gradually, under the relentless pressure of interrogation, under the weight of her own guilt for having failed to save her daughter, even though that failure was not criminal, but simply the limit of what any human could do in such circumstances, she began to crack. The confession, when it finally came, was not dramatic. There was no moment of breakdown, no tearful admission that she had set the fire and watched her daughter perish. Instead, there was ambiguity, statements that could be interpreted as acknowledgement of wrongdoing, words spoken in exhaustion that investigators took as admission. She said things like, "Maybe I should have done more," which in her mind meant she should have been more careful about fire safety, should have installed more smoke detectors, and should have had a better escape plan. But investigators heard it as admission that she had been negligent, that she bore responsibility, not in the emotional sense that any parent would feel, but in the criminal sense that could justify conviction. She said things like, "I don't know what happened," which was true. She did not fully understand how the fire had started, what sequence of events had led to the flames that took her daughter's life. But investigators heard it as evasion, as someone trying to avoid responsibility while knowing the truth. These fragments, these ambiguous statements, made under duress and grief, became the foundation of the prosecution's case. They were presented in court as confession, as the defendant's own acknowledgement of guilt, and the court accepted them as such, seeing in her words what investigators had wanted to see, what they had worked so hard to extract. Keiko Aoki was convicted of arson and negligent homicide in the passing of her own child, though the exact charges varied in legal terminology. She was sentenced to 21 years in prison, an enormous term that would consume the prime of her life, that would take her from her 30s into her 50s, from young adulthood to middle age, from the world where her daughter had existed to a world so changed that she would barely recognize it upon release. She entered the prison system in shock, unable to fully comprehend what had happened, how a tragic accident had been transformed into criminal conviction, how her grief had been weaponized against her, how the system designed to deliver justice had instead delivered only punishment for a crime she had not committed. The years in prison were hard, though in some ways the hardness was less about the conditions, which were as documented in places like Nagano, and more about the injustice, the knowledge that she was serving time for something she had not done, that her daughter's passing had been used against her, that the memory of her child had been poisoned by accusation and false confession. But Keiko Aoki did not give up. Even in prison, even surrounded by the mechanisms designed to break will and extract compliance, she maintained her innocence. She wrote letters, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps over the years, to lawyers and human rights organizations, to journalists and politicians, to anyone who might listen and help. She found allies eventually, people who read her story and saw the holes in the prosecution's case, who understood that confessions extracted under such circumstances are unreliable, that grief and exhaustion can produce statements that seem like admission, but are really just the words of someone who has lost the ability to defend herself effectively. Lawyers took her case pro bono, working without payment because they believed in her innocence and because the case represented something larger, a problem with the system itself, with its reliance on confession and its willingness to convict based on ambiguous statements rather than clear evidence of criminal intent and action. Human rights groups joined the effort, documenting her case, comparing it to others where false confessions had led to wrongful conviction, building a body of evidence that the system was flawed, that reforms were necessary, that Japan's 99% conviction rate might not reflect perfect justice, but rather perfect extraction of confession, regardless of truth. The appeal process in Japan is difficult, designed to be difficult, based on the principle that trials should be definitive, that once judgment has been rendered, it should not be easily overturned. But in rare cases, when evidence is compelling enough, when advocates are persistent enough, when the injustice is visible enough, appeals succeed. Keiko Aoki's case took years to work through the system, years during which she continued serving her sentence, continued living in the regulated world of prison routine, and continued hoping that eventually truth would prevail over the false narrative that had condemned her. And then, finally, the miracle happened. Not a miracle in the religious sense, though Keiko Aoki might have prayed for divine intervention during her darkest moments, but a miracle in the legal sense, the rare event of the system admitting error, of a conviction being overturned, of innocence being recognized after years of punishment. The court reviewed her case, examined the evidence with fresh eyes, and considered the circumstances under which her confession had been obtained. They found what her advocates had been arguing all along, that the confession was unreliable, that it had been coerced through psychological pressure, that it did not reflect actual guilt, but rather the breaking down of a grieving mother who could no longer resist the demands being placed on her. The fire, upon re-investigation, appeared to have been accidental after all. No clear evidence of arson could be established. The insurance policy was not suspicious, just a normal precaution. And the idea that a mother would cause her own daughter's death for such modest financial gain was, when examined critically, absurd. The kind of theory that only makes sense when one starts with suspicion and works backward to justify it. Keiko Aoki was released. She walked out of prison at age 51, having entered at 30. Having lost 21 years to wrongful imprisonment, having spent more than 2 decades paying for a crime she did not commit, for a tragedy she had tried desperately to prevent. The state acknowledged its error, though the acknowledgement came with a bureaucratic language that softens admission, that avoids direct acceptance of moral responsibility. They offered compensation, a sum calculated according to formulas that attempt to put monetary value on lost years, on suffering that cannot really be measured in currency. 750,000 euros. The amount sounds substantial until one considers what it represents. Roughly 35,000 euros per year of wrongful imprisonment. Less than many people earn in legitimate employment. An amount that cannot restore what was taken, cannot give her back her 30s and 40s, cannot undo the trauma of conviction and incarceration, cannot bring her daughter back or erase the fact that her child's passing was used as evidence against her. She took the money because what else could she do? Because refusing it would not change what had happened, because she needed resources to rebuild a life that had been thoroughly destroyed. She took it and tried to move forward, to find some way to exist in a world that had treated her with such cruelty under the banner of justice. And every week she places flowers where her daughter passed. The house is gone, rebuilt or replaced, the lot bearing no visible trace of the fire that once consumed it. But Keiko Aoki remembers exactly where her daughter's room was, exactly where she fell, exactly where her life ended. The flowers are a ritual of grief and memory, a way of maintaining connection to the child who should still be alive, who should be in her 30s now, who might have had children of her own, who might have made a life that Keiko Aoki could have been part of as grandmother, as continuing presence in a family line that the fire and the false convictions severed. The system that convicted her continues operating, continues extracting confessions, and continues producing its remarkable conviction rate. Reforms have been discussed, incremental changes proposed, but the fundamental architecture remains. The reliance on confession, the extended detention, the psychological pressure that produces admission whether the accused is guilty or innocent. Keiko Aoki's case is known among those who study wrongful conviction, cited in reports and academic papers, used as evidence that the system requires reform. But to most Japanese people, it remains obscure, one story among many, not sufficient to shake faith in institutions that generally function well, that keep crime low and maintain order. She lives quietly now, in a different city, trying to build something from the ruins, trying to find meaning in the years that remain. The compensation money helps with practical matters, with rent and food and medical care, but it cannot compensate for what was taken, cannot restore what was lost. 21 years, her daughter, her faith that justice would prevail, all gone, consumed by a system that demanded confession and would not accept innocence, that broke her, and then, decades later, admitted quietly that perhaps a mistake had been made. The flowers remain, each week, without fail. The only justice she can give her daughter now. The ghost on the row of final moments. His name is Iwao Hakamada. He is 84 years old. He walks for 3 to 4 hours every day, silent and hollow. He spent 48 years in a row for those awaiting their final moments, for unlawful takings of life he did not commit. Half his life, waiting for his own end. The neighborhood where he walks is ordinary, residential streets lined with modest homes, small gardens tended by elderly residents, vending machines standing sentinel on corners. Morning light filters through trees planted decades ago, their branches forming canopies that dapple the pavement with shadow and sun. It is peaceful here, quiet, the kind of place where nothing dramatic happens, where life proceeds at a measured pace determined by seasons and routines. Iwao Hakamada walks these streets each day, his route varying slightly, but his commitment to the ritual absolute. He walks alone in his mind, though a woman named Mashiko accompanies him physically, staying close but not intrusive, ready to help if needed, present as both companion and guardian for a man whose connection to reality remains fragile after decades of isolation and psychological torture. He does not speak, not to Mashiko, not to neighbors who recognize him and nod in greeting, not to anyone. The silence is not stubbornness or choice, but damage, the residue of years spent in conditions that broke something fundamental in his capacity to connect with other human beings through language. The words are still there, somewhere inside, but the bridge between thought and speech has been severed, or perhaps just buried so deeply under trauma that excavating it seems impossible. His face, when you look closely, carries the weight of those years visibly. Deep lines around his eyes and mouth, a gaze that seems to look through rather than at, focused on something internal or distant, not quite present in the immediate moment. His movements are careful, deliberate, the gait of someone who has learned not to trust his body entirely, who navigates the world with the caution of age compounded by the disorientation of a mind still adjusting to freedom after half a century without it. He is a local character now, known in the neighborhood, not for his crime or his conviction, but for his walks, for his silence, for the quiet tragedy that everyone understands even if they do not know the details. People have grown accustomed to seeing him, to the rhythm of his presence in their streets. He has become part of the landscape, as familiar as the vending machines and the carefully tended gardens, a reminder of something that most prefer not to think about too directly, but cannot entirely ignore. Mashiko walks beside him, matching his pace, speaking occasionally, though she does not expect response, her words more for her own benefit than his. a way of maintaining human connection, even when connection is not reciprocated. She has taken a liking to him, feels a responsibility born not of obligation, but of compassion, of recognizing in his brokenness a kind of testimony to failures that extend beyond any individual, that implicate systems and societies and all the structures human beings build ostensibly to deliver justice. When the walk concludes, when the hours have accumulated and the route has been completed, she accompanies him home. He lives with his sister, has lived with her since his release in 2014. His world shrunk to this house, these streets, the small sphere of safety and routine that she has created for him in the hope that something like recovery might be possible even after such destruction. His sister has kept mementos, tangible reminders of who Iwao Hakamada was before his arrest transformed him into something else, before the decades awaiting his final moments wore away the person he had been and left only this shell, functional but fundamentally altered, present but not quite alive in the way that term usually implies. The photographs show a young man, lean and strong, his body honed through training and discipline. He was a boxer, a professional fighter in the years before his arrest, competing in rings throughout Japan, building a modest career that might not have led to championship glory, but provided income and identity and a sense of purpose. He was good, not great, but good enough to make a living at it, to be known in certain circles, to have a future that seemed secure within the limited possibilities available to young men from working-class backgrounds in post-war Japan. Boxing requires particular qualities. Physical courage, obviously, the willingness to enter the ring and face opponents who wish to hurt you, who will hurt you if given the opportunity. But also mental discipline, the ability to train daily, to deny immediate pleasures in service of long-term goals, to maintain focus during fights that can shift from control to chaos in seconds. Iwao Hakamada possessed these qualities, demonstrating them repeatedly in training and competition. And then came the night that ended everything. The exact date is recorded in court documents, fixed in the official history that ruined his life. A fire at a company manager's house. 4 family members lost their lives, ending violently before the building was set ablaze to cover evidence. Money stolen, though not a large amount. Nothing that would justify such violence in any rational calculation. The police investigated, interviewed witnesses, gathered evidence, and eventually arrested Iwao Hakamada. The reasons for suspecting him were never entirely clear, never entirely convincing to those who examined the case critically years later. But at the time, in the immediate aftermath of such brutal events, the pressure to find a perpetrator was intense, and he became the target, the person upon whom investigators focused their efforts and suspicions. The interrogation was severe, not physically necessarily, though accounts vary and records from that era are incomplete, but psychologically, employing all the techniques that Japanese police had refined over decades, the methods that would later be criticized as producing false confessions, but were then considered legitimate investigative tools. Hour after hour, day after day, the same questions, the same accusations, the same insistence that he had committed these acts. That confession was the only path to relief from the pressure that was being applied with relentless intensity. He maintained his innocence initially, as most innocent people do, as his boxer's discipline and stubbornness allowed him to do despite the exhaustion and confusion that accumulated during extended interrogation. But eventually, like so many others in similar circumstances, he broke. The confession was extracted, signed, acknowledged as true, and became the foundation of the prosecution's case, even though it was recanted almost immediately. Even though Iwao Hakamada would spend the rest of his life insisting that he had been coerced, that the words were not true, that he had only signed to make the interrogation stop. The evidence against him was problematic from the beginning, though this would only become clear much later, only be recognized after decades of appeals and investigations by lawyers and activists who believed in his innocence and dedicated themselves to proving it. Police claimed to have found blood-stained clothing belonging to him, garments that supposedly linked him to the scene. But the discovery was suspicious, the clothing appearing in a location that had already been searched multiple times, materializing conveniently when other evidence proved insufficient. Years later, DNA testing would reveal that the blood on the clothing was not his, that the evidence that had been so crucial to his conviction was fabricated or contaminated, that the entire foundation of the case was built on sand. But such testing was not available in the years immediately following his arrest, and by the time technology advanced sufficiently to reveal the truth, he had already been awaiting his final moments for decades. The trial moved quickly, as trials often did in that era, especially when confession existed and the defendant was not wealthy or connected, not able to mount the kind of vigorous defense that might slow the machinery of justice or introduce doubt sufficient to prevent conviction. He was found guilty. The sentence was his own end, and at an age when most young men are building careers and starting families, Iwao Hakamada entered the nightmare of the Rao for those awaiting their final moments, a place from which most people never emerge except through execution. The law in Japan is solitary confinement by default. The condemned live alone in small cells, isolated from other inmates, from regular human contact, from almost all stimulation and connection that might maintain mental health and coherence. They are allowed books sometimes, paper to write on, visits from family, though these become less frequent as years accumulate and relationships strain under the weight of impossible circumstances. But primarily, they wait. They wait without knowing when their end will come, without schedule or countdown, without any ability to prepare psychologically for the moment when guards will arrive and inform them that today is the day, that the appeals have been exhausted, that the execution will proceed in a matter of hours. This uncertainty is its own form of torture, refined and intentional, based on the belief that knowing the exact date allows the condemned to achieve a kind of psychological closure, to prepare themselves, to rob the punishment of some of its terror. Better, the reasoning goes, to keep them in perpetual uncertainty, to make every day potentially the last day, to ensure that the punishment extends beyond the eventual physical act of execution to encompass years or decades of psychological suffering. Toshio Sakamoto knows this intimately. He is a former prison warden, a man who spent his career within the correction system, who rose through ranks to positions of authority and responsibility. He has witnessed many executions, stood in rooms where condemned prisoners met their ends, supervised the procedures that the state employs to end lives deemed forfeit through judicial process. When he speaks of the row, his voice carries the weight of experience and, perhaps, regret. Not regret for executing those who were genuinely guilty of terrible crimes, but regret for participating in a system that treats human beings with such calculated cruelty that extends punishment across decades, that breaks minds long before bodies are broken by rope or whatever method the execution employs. He describes the average stay as 7 years, though some inmates remain much longer, their cases winding through appeals, their executions delayed by legal challenges or simply by the backlog of cases awaiting final resolution. 7 years of not knowing, of waking each morning wondering if this is the day, of hearing footsteps in corridors and tensing with the fear that they are coming for you. And when the day finally comes, there is no warning given in advance, no night before where goodbyes can be said properly, where final words can be crafted with care, where the condemned can prepare spiritually or emotionally for what awaits. The guards simply arrive in the morning, inform the prisoner that the time has come, and the process begins immediately, moving with bureaucratic efficiency from cell to execution chamber, from life to its end in a span of hours. This was the reality Iwao Hakamada faced every day for 48 years. 48 years of waiting, of not knowing, of isolation that ground away at his mind until the person who had been a boxer, who had been Iwao Hakamada, with dreams and personality and connection to the world, became something else, someone else, a consciousness that still persisted, but barely resembled what it had been. His sister visited when she could, though the prison system does not make such visits easy and does not encourage families to maintain close ties with the condemned. She saw him deteriorate across the years, watched as his responses became less coherent, as his ability to maintain conversation diminished, as the light that makes a person recognizably themselves flickered and dimmed under the relentless pressure of solitary confinement and mortal uncertainty. She kept his letters, the correspondence he managed to produce during lucid periods, pages filled with protestations of innocence, with descriptions of his suffering, with pleas for help that no one seemed able to provide. The letters became less frequent as years passed, less coherent when they did arrive, until eventually they stopped entirely, his capacity to write worn away like everything else that made him human. But she did not give up. She continued advocating for him, continued insisting on his innocence, continued searching for lawyers or organizations that might take up his case, that might see in his story something worth fighting for. And eventually, after decades of effort, after countless disappointments and setbacks, the breakthrough came. DNA testing, technology that had not existed when he was convicted, that had only become available and reliable in recent years, was applied to the evidence that had condemned him. The blood on the clothing was tested, and the results were definitive. The blood was not his. The evidence that had been so crucial to conviction was demonstrably false, either fabricated or contaminated, but certainly not proof of his guilt. Armed with this evidence, lawyers petitioned for his release, arguing that his conviction was unsound, that he had been condemned based on manufactured evidence and coerced confession, that justice demanded his freedom after decades of wrongful imprisonment. The legal system, slow and resistant to admitting error, eventually yielded. In 2014, 48 years after his conviction, Iwao Hakamada was released. But the man who walked free was not the man who had been imprisoned. That person was gone, destroyed by decades of isolation and trauma. What emerged was someone fundamentally altered, a ghost of his former self, capable of basic function, but lacking the coherence and connection that characterize healthy human consciousness. He went to live with his sister, the only family member who had remained constant through the decades, who had never stopped believing in his innocence, who now took on the role of caretaker for a brother who was technically free but remained imprisoned within the damage that had been done to his mind. In November 2019, Pope Francis visited Japan. The papal visit was significant. A rare journey by the head of the Catholic Church to a nation where Christians comprise only about 1.5% of the population. The visit was diplomatic, spiritual, cultural, an effort to strengthen ties between the Vatican and Japan, to address shared concerns, to speak to universal themes of peace and justice. Among the themes the Pope addressed was capital punishment. The Catholic Church had evolved its position on such matters over recent decades, moving from acceptance as a necessary tool of justice to rejection as incompatible with human dignity and the possibility of redemption. Pope Francis had been particularly vocal on this issue, using his platform to advocate for abolition worldwide, to call on nations that still executed prisoners to reconsider their practices. His visit to Japan included a large public event, thousands gathering in an arena to hear him speak, to receive his blessing, to feel the presence of spiritual authority that transcends national boundaries and speaks to something universal in human experience. The crowd was diverse, Catholics certainly, but also many non-Catholics drawn by curiosity or respect by the significance of the visit regardless of their religious affiliation. And among the crowd, in the front rows where honored guests sat, was Iwao Hakamada, accompanied by his sister. His presence was intentional, arranged by advocates who understood the symbolic power of having someone who had survived awaiting his final moments, visible at an event where capital punishment would be discussed. He sat quietly, as he always did, his silence no longer unusual after so many years of it, his face showing little response to the spectacle surrounding him. When Pope Francis spoke, his words included a clear statement against capital punishment, a call for mercy and recognition of human fallibility, an acknowledgement that justice systems make mistakes and that those mistakes become irrevocable when executions are carried out. He did not mention Japan specifically, did not single out any nation for criticism, but his message was clear, and his presence in a country that still actively executes prisoners gave his words particular weight. The audience listened respectfully, as Japanese audiences do, without visible dissent or protest, regardless of whether individuals agreed or disagreed with what was being said. But outside the arena, in the broader society, support for capital punishment remained strong. Polls consistently showed approximately 80% of Japanese people favoring its retention, viewing it as appropriate punishment for the most serious crimes, as a deterrent that helped maintain the low crime rates that Japan enjoyed. In the year before the Pope's visit, 15 people had been executed in Japan. The number varied year to year depending on judicial timelines and political considerations, but executions continued steadily, carried out in facilities scattered throughout the country, announced publicly only after they were completed. The families of the condemned sometimes learning through media reports rather than official notification. And more than 100 people remained awaiting their final moments, waiting as Iwao Hakamada had waited, isolated and uncertain. Their days an endless preparation for an end that might come tomorrow or might not come for decades. Among them were some who were undoubtedly guilty of horrific crimes, who perhaps deserved the harshest punishment society could impose. But also among them, almost certainly, were others like Iwao Hakamada, innocent people condemned through false evidence or coerced confession, their wrongful convictions not yet recognized, their exonerations years or decades away if they came at all. The debate over capital punishment in Japan exists, but does not rage, does not dominate public discourse the way it might in nations where the issue is more contested. Most Japanese people accept it as part of their justice system, view it as consistent with cultural values that prioritize social order and collective security over individual rights, and see harsh punishment for serious crimes as not merely justified but necessary to maintain the harmony that allows society to function. But for those who have experienced the system from inside, for those who have awaited their final moments or watched loved ones disappear into that darkness, the debate takes on a different character, becomes not abstract philosophy, but lived reality. The difference between continued executions and abolition measured not in theoretical principles, but in human lives and the suffering they endure. Iwao Hakamada continues his walks, 3 to 4 hours daily, through streets that have become his world after decades when his world was a cell. He is free now, legally, technically, but the prison remains inside him, carried in memories that surface without warning. In the silence that shields him from engagement he cannot manage, in the damage that 48 years inflicted on a mind that might have healed from months or even a few years, but could not survive decades. His sister cares for him, maintains the household, ensures that his days have structure and safety, that the man he has become can exist with some measure of dignity, even if the man he was can never be recovered. She is elderly herself now, her own health declining, and she worries about what will happen when she is gone, who will care for her brother, whether anyone will remember that he was innocent, that he should never have been awaiting execution, that his broken silence is testimony to a system that failed him catastrophically. The compensation he received for his wrongful conviction, if any was paid, is not widely discussed. Some nations provide substantial reparations for years stolen by false imprisonment. Others offer token amounts or nothing at all. But no amount of money can restore 48 years, can repair the damage done by decades of solitary confinement and daily anticipation of execution, can give back the life that was taken piece by piece until almost nothing remained. Capital punishment persists in Japan, supported by supermajorities, carried out with bureaucratic regularity, defended as necessary and just. But in a quiet neighborhood, an old man walks each day, his silence a question that cannot be answered, his mere existence a reminder that systems built by human hands, no matter how carefully constructed, remain fallible, remain capable of devastating error. The walk continues, the system continues. And somewhere awaiting their final moments right now, someone waits in a cell, wondering if today will be the day. The last prisoners in Iwakuni, in the southwest of Japan, there is a women's prison. The inmates are old. Some are 85. They work 8 hours a day. They shuffle with walkers. They are cold, and some of them chose to be here. The city of Iwakuni sits on the southern coast, in Yamaguchi Prefecture, where mountains meet the sea, and history lingers in the form of a famous wooden bridge that arches across a river like a frozen wave. The bridge is a tourist attraction, one of Japan's most photographed structures, elegant and improbable, built centuries ago without nails, a testament to traditional engineering and aesthetic sensibility. But most tourists who visit the bridge, who take their photographs and buy their souvenirs, do not venture far from the historic district. They do not explore the residential areas that spread beyond the postcard views, the ordinary neighborhoods where ordinary people live ordinary lives. And they certainly do not visit the women's prison, a facility that exists outside the awareness of most visitors and many residents, known primarily to those who work there or have reason to know such places exist. The prison is modern in construction, but traditional in purpose. A place where women who have violated laws serve their sentences according to the same principles that govern male facilities throughout the country. Order, discipline, work, routine. The architecture is functional, designed for efficiency and security rather than comfort or aesthetics. The walls are high. The windows are barred. The doors locked with electronic precision. Inside, the population is aging, visibly and dramatically. 1 in 3 prisoners is over 65 years old, a statistic that would have seemed impossible a generation ago, but now reflects a broader demographic shift affecting all of Japan. The country is growing older, its birth rate among the lowest in the world, its population declining, and its median age rising year by year. The prisons, like every other institution, reflect this transformation. But the presence of elderly inmates is not simply a mathematical consequence of national demographics. It represents something else, something more troubling, a pattern of crime and punishment that reveals fissures in the social fabric, spaces where people fall through despite the systems designed to catch them. Walking through the facility, one is struck immediately by the incongruity of age and incarceration. These are not the young women one might expect in a prison, not the demographic that typically populates correctional facilities worldwide. These are grandmothers, great-grandmothers, women whose bodies carry the visible marks of decades lived, whose movements have slowed, whose health requires accommodations that prison systems were not originally designed to provide. They work nonetheless, 8 hours a day, the same schedule that governs younger inmates, the same expectation of productivity and compliance. In the factories where cushions are assembled or garments sewn, elderly women sit at workstations, their fingers moving through practiced motions, their bodies bent over materials that must be shaped and joined according to specifications. Some of them are 85 years old. The number seems impossible, defies the image most people hold of such advanced age as a time of rest and care, of grandchildren visiting and gentle days passing in comfort. But these women sit at industrial machines, working through shifts that would exhaust people half their age, maintaining the output expected by prison administrators and the companies that contract for inmate labor. The work is difficult for them, obviously so to anyone watching. Arthritis stiffens joints, making repetitive motions painful. Vision dims with age, makes precision work challenging, increases errors that must be corrected, and sometimes result in reprimands. Stamina declines, makes 8-hour shifts a test of endurance that younger bodies pass without particular effort, but older bodies struggle to complete. When the work ends, when the signal comes that the shift is over, some of these women do not simply walk back to their cells. They shuffle, using walkers to support weight that legs can no longer carry reliably, moving with the careful slowness of those who have fallen before and fear falling again, who understand that a broken hip at their age means not recovery, but likely their final moments, or at least permanent disability that prison medical facilities are not equipped to manage compassionately. The conditions are harsh in ways that go beyond the work itself. The prison has no central heating, a cost-saving measure, or perhaps simply an oversight. A failure to modernize facilities built in an era when energy was expensive and comfort was considered unnecessary for those being punished. In winter, the cold penetrates walls and floors, settles into cells and common areas, makes sleep difficult and waking painful. The elderly feel this cold more acutely than younger inmates. Their circulation is poorer, their bodies less able to generate and maintain warmth. They layer clothing as much as regulations permit, wrap themselves in thin blankets that provide minimal insulation, and endure the months when temperatures drop and staying warm becomes another challenge added to all the others that define life in confinement. Showers are rationed, limited to 2 or 3 times per week, a restriction that affects everyone but burdens the elderly particularly. Personal hygiene becomes difficult to maintain. Skin conditions develop. The simple dignity of cleanliness, taken for granted in the outside world, becomes a privilege dispensed according to schedules that have nothing to do with need or preference. This is far from a luxury retirement home, far from the assisted living facilities where elderly Japanese with resources spend their final years, where staff attend to needs and comfort is prioritized alongside safety. This is prison, and the fact that inmates are old does not fundamentally alter the nature of confinement, does not transform punishment into care, does not make the system gentle, simply because those it contains are fragile. And yet, some of them seem relieved to be here. Not happy, happiness being too strong a word for the emotions visible on lined faces, but relieved, grateful even, in the complicated way that people can be grateful for situations that are objectively terrible when the alternatives were somehow worse. There is a woman, 70 years old, currently serving her 4th sentence for shoplifting. 4 separate arrests, 4 separate convictions, 4 separate periods of incarceration for crimes that involved stealing items of minimal value. Food sometimes, shoes, a handbag, things that could easily be paid for by someone with even modest income, but that she took instead. reaching out in stores and slipping products into her bag with hands that trembled from age and possibly intention, from the knowledge that she was committing a crime, but doing so anyway. Why? The question seems obvious, but the answer is complex, rooted in circumstances that the statistics about Japan's aging society only partially capture. Outside the prison, before her latest arrest, she lived alone. Not unusual in a country where elderly people increasingly find themselves isolated, their children busy with careers in distant cities, their spouses gone, their friends diminished in number as time and declining health thin the social networks that once provided support and connection. Alone means different things to different people. For some, it is chosen solitude, peaceful retirement spent in contemplation and hobbies, relationships maintained through phone calls and occasional visits. But for others, particularly those without resources or family willing to assist, alone means dangerous isolation, days passing without human contact, meals eaten in silence, sickness endured without help, loneliness accumulating until it becomes a kind of madness, a desperation that manifests in choices that seem inexplicable from outside but make terrible sense from within. She let herself go. The phrase is euphemism, softening a reality that is harder to articulate directly. She stopped caring for herself with the attention that health requires, stopped eating properly, stopped maintaining her home, stopped engaging with the routines that keep people tethered to social norms and expectations. Depression, probably, though whether diagnosed or simply the natural consequence of isolation and purposelessness is unclear. And then she started shoplifting. Small things at first, perhaps, items that seemed insignificant, thefts that might have been overlooked or attributed to confusion, to the kind of forgetfulness that can accompany age. But she was caught, arrested, processed through the system, convicted, sentenced, and in prison, strange as it seems, she found something she had been missing outside: structure, regular meals, human presence, even if not friendship, a reason to wake each morning, a schedule to follow, tasks to complete, purpose of a sort. When that first sentence ended, she was released back into the world that had driven her to theft in the first place. Nothing had changed. She was still alone, still without resources or support, still facing the same isolation that had made prison seem, by comparison, tolerable. And so, she shoplifted again, and was arrested again, and convicted again. The cycle repeated, each iteration reinforcing the pattern, until it became clear to anyone paying attention that she was not stealing because she needed the items, but because she needed the consequence. She is not unique. The statistics tell the story at scale, numbers that would seem impossible if they were not carefully documented by government agencies tracking crime and demographics. In the past 20 years, crimes committed by senior citizens have increased fourfold, not doubled, not tripled. 4 times as many elderly people are being arrested, convicted, and incarcerated as 20 years ago. The crimes are predominantly minor, shoplifting most commonly, though also fraud, trespassing, occasionally violence when frustration or dementia removes the inhibitions that normally prevent aggressive behavior. These are not career criminals suddenly turning to crime in their golden years. These are people broken by isolation, by poverty, by the particular cruelties of aging in a society that has not adequately prepared for the demographic transformation it is experiencing. The prison system, designed for younger offenders, has had to adapt. Rehabilitation programs that once focused on job skills and anger management now include elements specifically tailored to elderly inmates. Acknowledgements that these women face different challenges and require different preparation for the release that most of them will eventually experience. There are workout programs, exercises designed for bodies that can no longer perform the vigorous calisthenics expected of younger inmates. Gentle stretching, balance training, movements intended to maintain mobility and prevent the atrophy that comes from sedentary confinement, that turns manageable old age into helpless debility. And there are classes, strange ones, surreal in their premise when one considers the population they serve. Baby care training, where elderly women learn or relearn how to hold infants, how to change diapers, how to soothe crying children. The logic, as explained by prison administrators, is that some of these women have grandchildren, or might upon release, and that providing care could give them purpose, could reconnect them to families that have drifted away, could offer a role in society that makes rearrest less likely. But the image is jarring nonetheless. Elderly women in prison uniforms, practicing with dolls, going through motions that most of them learned decades ago when their own children were infants, now relearning in the context of punishment and correction. As if the distance between them and their families is merely technical, a matter of missing skills, rather than broken relationships and mutual abandonment. The guards have adapted as well. Their training expanded to include aspects of elder care that prison work did not traditionally require. They monitor medications, assist with mobility when necessary, watch for signs of dementia or other cognitive decline that might require medical intervention. Their role has become hybrid, part correctional officer and part nursing assistant, a combination that speaks to the unusual nature of this population, to the fact that punishment and care must somehow coexist in the same institutional space. Elsewhere in Japan, prisons are emptying. The crime rate continues its decades-long decline, the result of cultural factors, effective policing, social cohesion, demographic aging. Facilities built to house large populations of young offenders now have empty wings, cells that remain unused, capacity that exceeds need. Some prisons have closed entirely, their purposes obsolete in a nation where fewer and fewer people commit crimes serious enough to warrant incarceration. But women's prisons, particularly those housing elderly inmates, are not emptying. They maintain their populations, their cells occupied by women who are sometimes there because they genuinely committed crimes that require punishment, but often there because they have nowhere else to go, because society has failed to provide alternatives, because prison has become, by default, a kind of last resort elder care for those who fall through every other safety net. It is a damning portrait, not of the prisons themselves, but of the society that produces this outcome. Japan prides itself on order, on low crime rates, on systems that function with remarkable efficiency. And indeed, the streets are safe, the cities clean, the mechanisms of daily life operating with precision that visitors from other countries find remarkable. But this order has a cost, and part of that cost is visible here. In this women's prison in Iwakuni, in the faces of elderly women who work 8-hour days and sleep in unheated cells and sometimes seem grateful for the structure that confinement provides, because the alternative was worse, was loneliness so profound it became unbearable. The Japanese learn discipline from childhood, absorb it through family and school and every social interaction. They learn to follow rules, to defer to authority, to place group harmony above individual preference. They learn to be quiet on trains, to sort garbage into elaborate recycling categories, to apologize for inconveniences they did not cause. And mostly, this cultural conditioning works, produces a society that functions smoothly, where public spaces are safe and clean, where systems operate reliably because people follow the rules that keep them functioning. But the system is not perfect. It leaves people behind, particularly those who cannot or will not conform, who fall outside the patterns that society expects and accommodates. And for some of these people, the prison system becomes the only institution that will take them, the only place where their basic needs for food and shelter and human presence will be met, even if met in the context of punishment, even if the price is freedom and dignity and any hope of genuine comfort in their final years. The question hangs in the air, unspoken but present in every cell, every workshop, every shuffling journey from one scheduled activity to another. Is this justice? Is this what a society should become when its population ages and its social bonds weaken? Is this the inevitable result of systems that prioritize order above all else, that measure success by crime rates and conviction percentages, that see human beings as components to be processed rather than individuals to be understood? There are no easy answers, no simple reforms that would solve the complex problems visible in this facility. The issues are structural, cultural, economic, demographic, all layered together in ways that defy quick solutions. But the questions remain, and they will grow more urgent as Japan continues aging, as more elderly people find themselves isolated and desperate, as the prisons fill with grandmothers who shoplifted because they were lonely and saw no other way to find human contact and care. The sun moves across the sky, marking the passage of another day in Iwakuni. The work shifts end. The elderly women return to their cells, prepare for the evening routines that will carry them towards sleep, toward another night in the cold, toward another morning when they will wake and begin again, following the schedule that gives shape to days that might otherwise dissolve into undifferentiated time. The city continues its life outside the walls, tourists visiting the famous bridge, residents going about their business. The ordinary flow of existence proceeding without interruption or awareness of what happens in the prison that most prefer not to think about, that represents failures too uncomfortable to acknowledge, questions too difficult to answer. And in Nagano, where this journey began, the mountain prison continues its routines as well. The music plays at 6 in the morning. The men wake and clean and march to work. The system operates with the precision that made it famous, that produces the statistics that Japan displays proudly when defending its approach to justice and correction. The machines run smoothly, the order holds, the discipline persists, woven into the culture so deeply that most do not question it, cannot imagine alternatives, see in the regulated life of prisons only an intensified version of the regulated life they all live. The rules and expectations that govern every hour of every day, that promise safety and stability in exchange for conformity and submission. Whether this is wisdom or tragedy, justice or oppression, success or failure, depends on perspective, on what one values, on whether the statistics about crime and order outweigh the human costs visible in padded cells and solitary confinement, and elderly women working through their final years in buildings without heat, without comfort, without anything resembling mercy. The choice, if choice is the right word, belongs to each society, to each generation that inherits systems built by those who came before and must decide whether to maintain or modify or dismantle them entirely. Japan has made its choice repeatedly through decades of practice and policy, through cultural conditioning so thorough that alternatives become almost unimaginable. The prisons stand, the inmates remain, the order persists, bought with suffering and isolation and the slow grinding away of human spirit in service of a harmony that some see as enlightened and others see as oppressive, that works for many, but crushes those who cannot or will not conform, who fall through cracks that the system does not acknowledge and will not address. The escape. The plan began in the most unlikely of places, in the mind of a man sitting in a Tokyo apartment, living under house arrest, surrounded by surveillance cameras, his every movement tracked, his communications monitored, his world shrunk to a few rooms, and the knowledge that at any moment prosecutors could arrest him again, that the cycle of detention and bail and rearrest could continue indefinitely until he broke or confessed or simply gave up. Carlos Ghosn had choices. He could continue fighting through the Japanese legal system, could maintain his innocence through years of trials and appeals, and could hope that eventually truth would prevail. Or he could do something that no one expected, that seemed impossible given the level of surveillance, that would either save him or destroy whatever remained of his reputation. He chose the impossible. The planning took months, conducted in whispers and encrypted messages, coordinated with people whose identities would later be revealed and whose roles would land some of them in prison. The basic outline was audacious to the point of absurdity. Smuggle one of the most recognizable executives in the world out of Japan, past airport security, past customs officials, past the web of surveillance that tracked his every movement. The key was a large box, the kind used to transport musical equipment, specifically designed to hold audio speakers and electronics. It was big enough to fit a human being, if that human being was willing to fold himself into an uncomfortable position and remain completely still for hours. The box would be transported by a private security company, loaded onto a private jet departing from Kansai International Airport and flown to Istanbul, then onward to Beirut. On December 29th, 2019, Carlos Ghosn prepared for what would be either his liberation or his final mistake. He dressed carefully, wearing clothes that would not rustle or make noise. He said goodbye to his wife, though they could not speak openly about what was happening, could only communicate through looks and careful touches, every word potentially monitored. The security operatives arrived at his apartment in the afternoon. They brought the equipment, including the large box that would become his escape pod. The box was positioned in a room away from the direct view of surveillance cameras. Carlos Ghosn climbed inside, folding his body into the cramped space, his knees pulled to his chest, his breathing controlled, knowing that any sound, any movement detected during transport could end the plan before it began. The lid closed. Darkness, complete and absolute. The air inside was limited, each breath consuming oxygen that would not be replenished until the box was opened. He could hear voices outside, muffled through the padding and walls, could feel the box being lifted, carried, loaded into a vehicle. Every bump and shift sent waves of discomfort through his cramped position, but he could not move, could not adjust, could only endure. The drive to the airport seemed endless. Minutes felt like hours. His body began to ache, muscles protesting the unnatural position. Cramps threatened in his legs and back. His breathing grew more labored as the oxygen inside the box depleted. But he forced himself to remain still, to remain silent, to trust that the plan would work, that the security operatives knew what they were doing, that the bribes and arrangements that had been made would hold. At the airport, the box was unloaded. He could hear more voices now, Japanese voices, security personnel checking cargo. His heart pounded so loudly he feared they would hear it, that the box would be opened, that he would be discovered and arrested and returned to detention, this time with no possibility of bail, this time until trial concluded years from now. But the inspection was cursory. The security company had credentials and had transported equipment through this airport many times before. The guards saw a manifest listing audio equipment, saw a legitimate company with proper documentation, and waved the box through. It was loaded onto the private jet, placed in the cargo area where it would remain for the duration of the flight. The plane took off. Inside the box, Carlos Ghosn felt the acceleration. The moment when wheels left the runway and the aircraft climbed into Japanese airspace. He was leaving Japan, escaping the jurisdiction that had held him for more than a year. But he was not yet safe. The flight to Istanbul would take hours, hours in complete darkness, in a space barely large enough for his body, breathing air that grew staler with each passing minute. He lost track of time in the darkness. His mind drifted through memories and fears, through calculations of what would happen if he was discovered in Istanbul, if Turkish authorities decided to cooperate with Japanese extradition requests, if the plan fell apart at any of the dozen points where it could fail. But mostly, he thought about freedom, about the possibility of living without surveillance, without the constant threat of rearrest, without the grinding pressure of a system designed to extract confession regardless of truth. The plane landed in Istanbul. The cargo was unloaded, transferred to another aircraft. The box was moved again, more handling, more risk of discovery, but also moving further from Japanese jurisdiction, closer to the final destination where Lebanon's refusal to extradite its citizens would provide sanctuary. The second flight was shorter. Carlos Ghosn remained in the box, his body now screaming with pain, his muscles locked in cramps that would take days to fully resolve, his mind beginning to fragment from oxygen deprivation and the psychological stress of hours in complete darkness with no communication, no reassurance, no knowledge of whether the plan was succeeding or failing. And then, finally, voices in Arabic. The plane had landed in Beirut. The cargo was being unloaded, and this time, unlike the previous stops, the box was opened. Light flooded in, blinding after so many hours of darkness. Hands reached in, helped him climb out, his body stiff and uncooperative, his legs barely able to support his weight. He breathed deeply, air that tasted like the sweetest thing he had ever experienced, and looked around at faces that were smiling, that were congratulating him, that were welcoming him to freedom. He was in Lebanon. He was safe. He had done what everyone said was impossible, what the Japanese system believed could never happen to someone under such tight surveillance. He had escaped. The Japanese authorities would not learn of his escape for several more hours. By the time they checked his apartment and found him gone, by the time they reviewed surveillance footage and realized what had happened, by the time they issued arrest warrants and contacted Interpol, Carlos Ghosn was already planning his press conference, already preparing to tell the world his story, already transforming from fugitive to symbol of resistance against a system he characterized as fundamentally unjust. The escape would become legendary, discussed in legal circles and media outlets worldwide, analyzed for how it was accomplished and what it revealed about gaps in surveillance and security, debated for what it meant about justice and jurisdiction and the rights of the accused. Some would call him courageous for refusing to submit to a system he believed was corrupt. Others would call him a criminal, compounding his crimes with flight, proving through his actions that he was guilty of something, even if not everything he was accused of. But in that moment, climbing out of the box in Beirut, breathing free air for the first time in months, Carlos Ghosn cared nothing for these debates. He was free. He had escaped, and the machine that had held him, that had ground him down day after day, had finally been defeated, if only in this one case, if only for this one man. The escape had worked, but it had also created a different kind of prison, one where he could never return to Japan, could never travel to most countries without risk of arrest, where his freedom was real but circumscribed, bounded by the reach of extradition treaties and the long memory of a system that does not forgive, that does not forget, that would continue pursuing him through diplomatic and legal channels for as long as he lived. The box that had carried him to freedom was later recovered by authorities, examined as evidence in the case against those who had helped him escape. It sat in an evidence room, an ordinary shipping container that had become the vehicle of an extraordinary flight, a symbol of one man's refusal to submit and a system's failure to maintain total control. After the walls, the gate opens at dawn. The man who walks through it has served his sentence, paid his debt to society according to the calculus of law and time. He carries a small envelope containing the money he earned through years of prison labor, a sum that seems substantial until divided by the days worked, until compared to what freedom actually costs. He wears clothes that were fashionable when he entered, but are now dated, marking him immediately as someone out of time, and he steps into a world that continues without him, that fills his absence with nothing, that expects him to simply resume life as if the years in between never happened. This is the part of the story that the prison festivals do not tell, that the clean facilities and orderly routines do not prepare anyone for. The moment after release, when the structure that defined every hour suddenly disappears, when the man who learned to wait for permission to speak must now initiate conversations, when the body that woke to classical music must now set its own alarm, when the mind that surrendered decision-making must now choose what to do with each hour of each day. For some, the transition is manageable. They have families waiting, homes to return to, jobs promised by employers willing to give second chances. They step through the gate into embraces, into cars that drive them away from the mountain or the city facility, into lives that were paused but not destroyed, that can be resumed with effort and patience and the willingness of others to forgive. But for many, there is no one waiting. The families that sent letters in the first months stopped writing years ago. The emotional cost of maintaining connection too high. The shame of having a relative in prison too heavy to bear. The jobs that were promised proved temporary when employers reconsidered, when they calculated the risks and decided that hiring someone with a criminal record was not worth whatever benefit the worker might provide. These men stepped through the gate alone. They walked to the nearest train station, their movements uncertain, overwhelmed by choices that seem simple to everyone else, but feel impossible after years of having every decision made for them. Which train to take? Where to go? What to do first? The envelope in their pocket contains maybe $300, maybe less. Enough for a week of survival if they are careful. Not enough for a month. Not nearly enough to rebuild a life. The first challenge is housing. In Japan, renting an apartment requires multiple guarantors, people who will vouch for you, who will accept financial responsibility if you fail to pay rent. For most citizens, this is a minor inconvenience, a matter of asking family or friends to sign forms. For released prisoners, it is often an insurmountable barrier. Who will guarantee someone with a criminal record? Who will risk their own financial standing for someone they may barely remember? The result is that many released prisoners end up in flop houses, cheap accommodations that ask fewer questions, that accept weekly or daily payments, that provide a place to sleep but little else. The rooms are tiny, often shared, with communal bathrooms and minimal privacy. The other residents are similarly marginal, people existing on the edges of society. And while there is solidarity in shared circumstances, there is also danger, the risk of exploitation or violence, or simply the grinding proximity of too many desperate people in too small a space. The second challenge is employment. Japanese law requires job applicants to disclose criminal records. Every application form has a box to check, a question to answer honestly or risk legal consequences for lying. And with that box checked, most applications go nowhere. Employers see the criminal record and discard the resume, unwilling to take a chance, unwilling to invest training in someone who might reoffend, unwilling to have customers or clients discover that they employ a former convict. The jobs that remain are the hardest, the lowest paying, the ones that no one else wants. Construction sites where the work is brutal and the pay barely covers expenses. Factories on the outskirts of cities where shifts run through the night and safety standards are loosely enforced. Kitchen work in restaurants that serve cheap food to customers who do not look closely at who prepares it. These jobs provide survival, but not advancement. income, but not enough to save, to accumulate the resources needed to move beyond marginal existence. The third challenge, perhaps the most difficult, is psychological. The prison system, designed to instill discipline, creates a kind of learned helplessness, a dependence on external structure that makes autonomous functioning difficult. Men who spent years waiting for permission to speak now struggle to assert themselves, to advocate for their needs, to navigate conflicts or negotiate with employers, or simply to maintain the kind of self-direction that free life requires. Some develop what researchers call institutionalization syndrome, a condition where the structure of prison becomes so internalized that freedom feels like chaos, where the absence of rules and schedules creates anxiety rather than relief, where the mind keeps expecting whistles and inspections and the familiar rhythms of controlled life. These men struggle to sleep without the lights-out signal, to eat without the meal schedule, to fill the hours that were once filled by mandatory work and enforced routines. Recidivism rates tell the story statistically. In Japan, they are lower than in many countries, partly because crime rates are generally low, partly because the system does succeed in instilling lasting discipline in some cases. But they are not zero. Some percentage of released prisoners commit new crimes, return to prison, and begin the cycle again. And for some, this return feels almost like relief, like coming home to familiar structure after the chaos of freedom proved too overwhelming. There are support systems, theoretically. Government programs that help with housing and employment, non-profit organizations that specialize in reintegration, halfway houses that provide transitional support. But these resources are limited, underfunded, difficult to access, without knowledge of bureaucratic systems that can be opaque even to those who grew up navigating them, let alone to those who have been isolated from society for years. And there remains the social stigma, the invisible mark that never quite fades. Japanese society values conformity and harmony, and those who have broken laws, who have demonstrated inability or unwillingness to follow rules, carry that failure forward. Neighbors may know or discover the criminal history. Colleagues may learn and change their behavior, become cold or distant, or simply careful. Potential romantic partners run background checks and disappear after discovering the conviction. The isolation that drove some to crime in the first place reasserts itself. The loneliness that made prison structure appealing returns with new intensity. And for elderly releases, like the women who shoplifted their way back into prison repeatedly, the calculation becomes simple. Better to be confined with structure and human presence than free in isolation with no support. There are success stories, men who rebuild lives, who find employers willing to give chances, who reconnect with families willing to forgive, who develop the resilience and skills needed to navigate freedom after years of constraint. They save money gradually, move from flop houses to modest apartments, advance from the hardest jobs to slightly better ones, create routines that provide structure without requiring external enforcement. But these stories are the exception, celebrated precisely because they are rare, held up as proof that the system works even though they often succeed despite rather than because of institutional support. The typical story is less triumphant, survival rather than thriving, marginal existence rather than reintegration, and for too many, the slow drift back toward crime, toward the decisions that will send them through those gates again, will return them to cells and schedules and the familiar structure of controlled life. As the sun rises over the prison in Nagano, somewhere a man is walking through gates into uncertain freedom. He carries his small envelope, wears his dated clothes, steps into a world that may or may not have space for him. Tomorrow, another will follow, and the day after, another. The gate opens and closes, releases and receives, in a cycle that continues regardless of whether any individual succeeds or fails, regardless of whether the system's stated goal of rehabilitation is achieved, or whether it simply processes people through punishment and releases them to struggle or succeed on their own. The mountain keeps its watch. The walls stand firm. And somewhere in the valley below, a released prisoner stands at a train station platform, trying to remember how to make choices, trying to imagine a future that feels possible, trying to believe that the years lost were not simply lost, but somehow transformed into lessons or strength, or whatever it is that makes survival possible when the world offers so little support and demands so much proof that you have changed, that you deserve a second chance, that you will not fail again. We have walked through a world that exists beyond most people's awareness, a place where order becomes absolute and individuality dissolves into collective discipline. The stories we've encountered reveal a fundamental truth. Systems built by human hands reflect the values of those who built them. Japan's prison system is not an aberration, but a distillation of cultural priorities taken to their logical extreme. Order over chaos, group over individual, harmony over freedom. The statistics are real. Crime is rare in Japan. The streets are safe in ways other nations can barely imagine. But that safety comes at a price, paid by those who fall outside the patterns, who cannot or will not conform. We've met those who paid that price. Keiko Aoki, who lost her daughter to fire and 21 years to a false conviction. Iwao Hakamada, who spent 48 years awaiting his final moments for crimes he did not commit, who walks now in silence, his mind shattered by decades of isolation. Mark Karpeles, who survived 11 months of custody and chose to stay in the country that broke him. Carlos Gozan, who escaped in a box rather than face indefinite detention. And the elderly women in Iwakuni who commit crimes because loneliness has become unbearable, because prison offers the structure and human contact that society no longer provides. These are not isolated failures. They are features of a system that values conviction over truth, that demands confession over proof, that measures success by statistics rather than lives. The question is not whether Japan's approach works by its own measures. It does. The question is what we're willing to sacrifice for order, how much humanity will grind away in pursuit of safety, where we draw the line between justice and oppression. There are no easy answers, only choices made individually and collectively through what we celebrate and what we condemn, through the systems we build and the ones we dismantle. The mountain prison in Nagano will wake tomorrow to classical music, as it has for years, as it will for years to come unless something fundamental changes. The men will clean their cells and march to factories and work in silence and count the days remaining in their sentences, or stop counting because the numbers have become too large to hold in consciousness. And elsewhere, in cities and towns throughout Japan, people will wake to their own routines, follow their own rules, and participate in the collective life that the prison system ultimately serves. They will ride trains in silence and separate their garbage into careful categories and bow at appropriate depths to those above them in social hierarchies. Whether this trade is worth making, whether the price paid by those in prisons is acceptable in exchange for the safety enjoyed by those outside, is a question each person must answer according to their own values. For now, the night deepens. The stories have been told. The prisons continue their work in darkness while those outside sleep, untroubled by the machinery that operates beyond their awareness, that maintains the order they rely upon without thinking about its cost or mechanisms. Rest now. Let the weight of these stories settle. Find their place among all the complicated truths that make up our understanding of the world. Remember that systems built by humans can be changed by humans, that order and justice need not be enemies, that it is possible to imagine ways of living together that honor both safety and dignity. If you found value in this journey, consider subscribing to this channel, where we explore the complexities of history and human systems with the calm attention they deserve. Share these stories with others who might benefit from seeing clearly, from understanding deeply. Until next time, sleep well. The questions will still be here when you wake, and perhaps together we can work toward answers that honor both order and mercy, both community and individual, both the need for safety and the requirement of justice that is not just efficient, but truly just. Good night.